The story of the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet begins not in a wind tunnel but in the mind of a visionary engineer watching sailplanes glide over the Rhone Mountains in 1928. A moment when Alexander Lippisch first conceived the radical idea that aircraft could fly without propellers by harnessing rocket propulsion. Lippisch, a pioneer of tailless delta-wing designs, had spent the 1920s proving that aircraft stability could be achieved through wing geometry alone rather than conventional tail assemblies, a heresy in aviation circles that dismissed his gliders as flying wings destined to tumble from the sky. Yet Lippisch's designs consistently demonstrated superior glide ratios and stability, catching the attention of the German Research Institute for Gliding Flight, where he established a reputation for solving aerodynamic problems others considered insoluble. His breakthrough came in 1937 when Wernher von Braun's rocket team at Kummersdorf demonstrated a liquid-fueled rocket motor producing 3,300 pounds of thrust, sufficient power, Lippisch calculated, to propel a lightweight airframe to speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, a velocity conventional propeller aircraft could never achieve due to compressibility effects near the sound barrier. Lippisch immediately recognized the military potential. An interceptor capable of climbing to 30,000 feet in 3 minutes could reach Allied bomber formations before they released their payloads, fundamentally altering the strategic bombing equation that was beginning to haunt German planners as British night raids intensified. He drafted a proposal for a rocket-powered interceptor designated DFS-194 and submitted it to the Reich Air Ministry in late 1938. The initial response was skepticism bordering on ridicule. Senior officials questioned the practicality of an aircraft with 7 minutes of total flight time, dismissed rocket propulsion as firework technology, and noted that no existing landing gear could withstand the stresses of high-speed touchdown on primitive grass airfields. Lippisch persisted, building a series of increasingly sophisticated glider prototypes to validate his delta-wing concept. The DFS-39 glider, flown in 1939, demonstrated exceptional stability at high speeds and gentle stall characteristics, critical attributes for an aircraft that would spend its entire operational life near stall speed during landing approach. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Air Ministry's attitude shifted dramatically. The effectiveness of Luftwaffe dive bombers against Polish targets masked a growing anxiety about future air defense needs. Planners recognized that Britain's industrial capacity would eventually produce bomber fleets too large for conventional fighters to intercept effectively. Lippisch's rocket interceptor concept suddenly appeared less like science fiction and more like strategic necessity. In 1940, the project received formal approval and transfer to Messerschmitt's Augsburg Design Bureau, where Lippisch's team would develop the aircraft under Willy Messerschmitt's corporate umbrella while retaining substantial design autonomy. A compromise reflecting Messerschmitt's political influence and Lippisch's technical indispensability. The timing proved fortuitous. The Battle of Britain's outcome, German failure to achieve air superiority over southern England, convinced Luftwaffe leadership that new defensive technologies were essential before Allied bombers could reach German airspace in force. The Me 163 project received highest priority designation in 1941. With resources diverted from other programs despite Germany's increasingly strained industrial capacity. Yet this priority came with catastrophic constraints. The aircraft had to be ready for operational deployment by mid-1943, a deadline demanding radical simplification of systems that would normally undergo years of testing. Safety features deemed non-essential were eliminated. Pilot protection systems were reduced to absolute minimums. Even basic redundancy in flight controls was sacrificed to save weight. The Me 163 thus entered development not as a mature engineering project but as a desperate gamble. A technological Hail Mary pass thrown by a regime recognizing its strategic vulnerability but unwilling to acknowledge the industrial realities that would ultimately determine the air war's outcome. Lippisch's design philosophy reflected this desperation. The airframe itself was a masterpiece of minimalist engineering. A sleek delta wing 30 feet in span housing fuel tanks, pilot compartment, and rocket motor in a single integrated structure weighing just 4,200 pounds empty. The wing's thick airfoil section provided structural strength while creating internal volume for 1,050 pounds of fuel, T-Stoff oxidizer, 80% hydrogen peroxide. In the forward tank, C-Stoff fuel, hydrazine hydrate/methanol mixture. In the aft tank, the Walter HWK 109-509, a rocket motor mounted directly behind the pilot, produced 3,750 pounds of thrust at full power, enough to accelerate the aircraft from standstill to 200 miles per hour in 12 seconds, a rate of acceleration that would pin pilots against their seatbacks with 3 times the force of gravity. Yet this performance came at horrific cost. The rocket motor consumed fuel at a rate of 140 pounds per second at full thrust, meaning the entire fuel load would be exhausted in precisely 7.5 minutes of powered flight. Lippish's team calculated that a typical interception profile would require 4 minutes to climb to bomber altitude, 2 minutes to position for attack, and 1.5 minutes for the return glide to base, a timeline leaving zero margin for error, unexpected headwinds, or evasive maneuvers by bomber formations. More critically, the rocket motor's operation created conditions that would prove lethal to pilots in ways designers failed to anticipate. The combustion chamber operated at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, radiating enough heat through the firewall to raise cockpit temperatures to 60 degrees Celsius within minutes. Temperatures that would cause pilots to lose consciousness from heat exhaustion before fuel exhaustion. The motor's exhaust plume, visible for miles as a brilliant white contrail, made the aircraft impossible to conceal during attack runs, eliminating any element of surprise against bomber gunners who could track the Komet's approach from 10,000 yards away. Most dangerously, the fuel combination itself represented a chemical hazard of unprecedented severity in aviation history. T-Stoff oxidizer reacted explosively with organic materials, cotton, leather, human skin, while C-Stoff fuel was hypergolic with T-Stoff, igniting spontaneously on contact without need for ignition source. A single drop of T-Stoff on a pilot's flight suit would begin dissolving the fabric within seconds, exposing skin to chemical burns that would penetrate to bone within minutes. Yet these dangers were downplayed in official briefings to pilots, who were told the fuels were hazardous but manageable with proper procedures, a lie that would cost dozens of lives before the war's end. The Me-163's landing system represented another cascade of compromises born of weight-saving obsession. Conventional retractable landing gear would have added 400 pounds to empty weight, unacceptable given the already marginal fuel capacity. Lippish's solution was radical: a 2-wheeled dolly for takeoff that would be jettisoned after becoming airborne, leaving the aircraft to land on a retractable skid mounted beneath the fuselage centerline. This skid, essentially a sprung steel runner with minimal shock absorption, required pilots to execute perfect 3-point landings at precisely 145 miles per hour. Any deviation in attitude or speed would cause the aircraft to bounce, ground loop, or cartwheel with catastrophic results. Test pilots quickly discovered that the skid provided virtually no directional stability during the landing roll. The aircraft would weathercock into crosswinds with terrifying abruptness, often flipping onto its back before the pilot could react. Yet this flaw was deemed acceptable because operational doctrine assumed Me-163s would operate only from prepared concrete runways with minimal crosswinds, a fantasy that collapsed when Allied bombing destroyed Germany's airfield infrastructure in 1944, forcing operations from grass strips and damaged concrete with unpredictable wind conditions. The Me-163 thus emerged from design not as a coherent weapon system but as a collection of brilliant solutions to isolated problems: extraordinary climb rate, revolutionary speed, compact size, combined with catastrophic failures in system integration. It could reach bomber formations faster than any aircraft in history, but could not stay with them long enough to make multiple firing passes. It could outmaneuver any escort fighter in a dive, but could not climb back to altitude after expending its fuel. It could carry devastating armament, 230 million Malawian kwaches, 108 cannons with sufficient hitting power to destroy a B-17 with 3 hits, but pilots rarely achieved more than 1 firing opportunity before fuel exhaustion forced disengagement. Most critically, it demanded superhuman piloting skill for routine operations while providing zero margin for error, a combination that transformed every flight into a high-stakes gamble where survival depended more on luck than training. When the first production Me-163B rolled out of the Castle factory in June 1944, it represented not the culmination of rational weapons development but the embodiment of a regime's desperation, technological brilliance divorced from operational reality, engineering achievement divorced from human factors, speed divorced from survival. The aircraft that could fly faster than any machine before it was also the aircraft most likely to kill its own pilot, a paradox that would define its entire operational history and transform it from intended war winner into monument to the dangers of prioritizing raw performance over basic safety. This paradox would haunt aerospace engineering for decades, resurfacing in the X-15 rocket plane program where similar trade-offs between speed and safety created parallel tragedies, and echoing today in debates about autonomous weapons where algorithmic speed threatens to outpace human oversight. The Me-163 thus stands not as historical curiosity but as permanent warning that the most dangerous failures in engineering are not technical breakdowns but ethical abdications, the choice to solve fascinating physics problems while ignoring the human beings who must operate the resulting machines. The rocket plane that could touch the edge of space ultimately could not bridge the chasm between technical possibility and human survival, a chasm that remains humanity's most dangerous frontier not because it is technological but because it is moral. The chemical horror of Me-163 operations emerged not as theoretical risk but as daily reality for pilots and ground crews who worked with T-Stoff and C-Stoff fuels. A reality documented in medical reports, accident investigations, and pilot testimonies that reveal a level of suffering rarely acknowledged in popular histories of the aircraft. T-Stoff oxidizer, an 80% concentration of hydrogen peroxide stabilized with phosphoric acid and tin compounds, possessed deceptively innocuous appearance, clear, slightly viscous liquid resembling water, but concealed chemical properties that made it one of the most dangerous substances handled by any military during the Second World War. Upon contact with organic materials, cotton flight suits, leather gloves, human skin, the solution initiated violent exothermic decomposition, releasing oxygen gas and heat in quantities sufficient to cause third-degree chemical burns within 30 seconds. The burns themselves were particularly insidious. Unlike thermal burns that damaged surface tissue, T-Stoff penetration continued through successive skin layers, dissolving subcutaneous fat and connective tissue until reaching bone, a process victims described as feeling my hand melt from the inside out. Medical records from Luftwaffe field hospitals document cases where pilots suffered fuel splashes on gloved hands. The T-Stoff dissolved leather gloves within 15 seconds, then began dissolving skin beneath. By the time medics removed the gloves 45 seconds later, tissue damage had penetrated to the metacarpal bones, necessitating immediate amputation to prevent systemic toxicity. More terrifying was T-Stoff's interaction with blood. When the oxidizer contacted open wounds, even minor cuts from cockpit fittings, the reaction accelerated dramatically, generating heat sufficient to coagulate blood proteins instantly while releasing oxygen bubbles that entered the bloodstream, causing gas embolisms that could trigger cardiac arrest within minutes. Pilot Wolfgang Spate, one of the Me-163's most experienced operators, documented in his post-war memoir an incident where his wingman suffered a minor fuel leak during taxi. A single drop of T-Stoff landed on the pilot's wrist where his flight suit cuff had ridden up. The pilot initially felt only mild stinging, but within 90 seconds his entire forearm had swollen to twice normal size with blisters the size of eggs. Medics amputated at the elbow 3 hours later, but the pilot died of septic shock 2 days after surgery, a death Spate attributed not to the chemical itself, but to the Luftwaffe's inadequate medical protocols for chemical burn treatment. C-Stoff fuel presented different but equally severe hazards. The mixture of 57% methanol, 30% hydrazine hydrate, and 13% water created a hypergolic combination with T-Stoff, igniting spontaneously on contact without need for spark or flame, but also possessed toxic properties that made chronic exposure nearly as dangerous as acute contact. Hydrazine hydrate, a rocket propellant still used today in satellite thrusters, is a potent carcinogen and neurotoxin that penetrates skin and mucous membranes with alarming efficiency. Ground crews who handled C-Stoff without adequate protective equipment developed symptoms within weeks. Persistent headaches, tremors and fine motor control, memory impairment, and in severe cases, permanent neurological damage resembling Parkinson's disease. Luftwaffe medical officers documented a cluster of 17 ground crew deaths at Brandes Airfield between October 1944 and February 1945, officially attributed to unknown respiratory illness. Autopsy reports later declassified revealed lung tissue damage consistent with chronic hydrazine exposure, though commanders suppressed this connection to avoid grounding essential personnel. The fueling process itself represented a ritual of controlled terror that every Me-163 pilot endured before each flight. Ground crews wearing rubberized protective suits and full-face respirators would approach the aircraft with extreme caution, carrying fuel containers suspended from poles to maintain maximum distance from their bodies. T-Stoff loading required two operators working in precise coordination. One to open the fuel cap using a 10-foot pole with hook attachment, another to pour fuel through a funnel mounted on an extension pole. Even with these precautions, minor splashes were inevitable. Fuel droplets aerosolized by wind or impact would drift toward personnel, requiring immediate decontamination with copious water flushing. Pilots waited in the cockpit during fueling, sealed inside a cockpit that offered minimal protection against fuel leaks. A vulnerability tragically demonstrated on July 24, 1944, when test pilot Haney Dittmar suffered a fuel line rupture during pre-flight checks. T-Stoff sprayed into the cockpit, dissolving his flight suit and burning his legs before he could bail out. Dittmar survived but lost both legs below the knee, ending his flying career and casting a pall over the entire test program that commanders attempted to conceal from operational pilots. The psychological toll of this constant chemical threat compounded the physical dangers. Pilots developed elaborate superstitions around fueling procedures, touching cockpit metal 3 times before engine start, reciting personal mantras during taxi, avoiding eye contact with ground crews during fueling, all coping mechanisms for managing terror that official briefings dismissed as unscientific. More significantly, pilots learned to conceal minor fuel exposures from medical officers to avoid grounding. Flight logbooks from Jägerschwader 400 reveal multiple instances where pilots logged flights within hours of documented fuel splashes that should have mandated 72-hour medical observation. A deception enabled by medical officers who faced pressure to maintain operational readiness despite known risks. This culture of concealment created a feedback loop where accident investigators lacked accurate data on fuel-related incidents, leading to inadequate safety modifications and perpetuating the cycle of exposure and injury. The Me 163's fuel system design exacerbated these hazards through catastrophic engineering oversights. Fuel lines ran directly beneath the pilot's seat with minimal shielding, a decision made to save 12 pounds of weight, but creating a single point of failure where a minor leak would flood the cockpit within seconds. The fuel shutoff valves required manual operation during emergency procedures, a task impossible with hands burned by leaking fuel. Most critically, the cockpit lacked any emergency decontamination system, no water spray nozzles, no neutralizing agent dispensers, not even a simple pull cord to jettison the canopy instantly. Pilots who suffered fuel leaks faced a horrific choice: remain in the cockpit and risk death from chemical burns, or attempt bailout at low altitude with severely impaired motor function from pain and shock. At least 3 documented fatalities resulted from pilots attempting bailout after fuel leaks: aircraft crashing because pilots lost consciousness during parachute deployment sequence, bodies recovered with chemical burns covering 60 to 80% of body surface. Ground crew suffering was even more severe yet less documented. Unlike pilots whose injuries attracted attention due to their elite status, ground personnel were considered expendable, replaced quickly when injured, their suffering rarely recorded in official channels. Survivor testimonies collected by German historians in the 1990s reveal a hidden casualty count. At least 47 ground crew members died from fuel-related accidents between 1944 and 1945, with hundreds more suffering permanent disabilities. One particularly tragic incident occurred at Venlo Airfield on November 12, 1944, when a fuel truck overturned during night operations. 1,200 liters of T-Stoff spilled across the tarmac. 6 crewmen attempting to contain the spill suffered severe burns. 2 died at the scene from inhalation of oxygen-rich vapors that caused pulmonary edema. 4 survived with permanent lung damage but were denied disability pensions after the war because their injuries were classified as industrial accidents rather than combat-related. The Me 163's chemical legacy extended beyond wartime casualties into post-war technological development. Captured Me 163s and fuel documentation provided American and Soviet engineers with critical data on hypergolic propellants that would inform Cold War rocket development, but also with sobering lessons about handling hazards that shaped safety protocols for decades. NASA's early rocket programs adopted stringent fuel handling procedures directly influenced by Me 163 accident reports: mandatory full-body protective suits, remote fueling systems, emergency deluge showers at launch pads, all measures born from German suffering that American engineers wisely chose not to repeat. Yet even these precautions proved insufficient in some cases. The 1960 Nettelen catastrophe in the Soviet Union, where a prototype ICBM exploded during fueling, killing 126 personnel, demonstrated that hypergolic propellant dangers persisted despite improved safety measures. A reminder that some technological risks cannot be engineered away, only managed through constant vigilance. The Me 163 thus bequeaths a dual legacy. On one hand, critical propulsion data that accelerated space exploration. On the other, a permanent warning about the human cost of normalizing extreme hazards in pursuit of performance. This warning resonates with particular urgency today as emerging technologies present parallel ethical dilemmas. Autonomous weapons systems that may malfunction with catastrophic consequences, AI algorithms that optimize for efficiency while ignoring human safety margins, hypersonic vehicles operating at the edge of material limits where single-point failures mean certain death. The Me 163's fuel tragedy teaches not that dangerous technologies should never be developed, but that their development must include honest accounting of human costs, transparent reporting of accidents, and institutional cultures that prioritize safety over schedule. A lesson many contemporary tech companies have yet to learn. The rocket plane that dissolved its pilot's flesh thus delivers its most valuable payload not in speed records or combat claims, but in ethical insight that technological progress without moral constraint serves not human advancement but human sacrifice, that engineering brilliance divorced from compassion becomes not triumph but tragedy, and that the true measure of a technology's worth lies not in its peak performance but in its respect for the humans who must operate it. This insight, forged in the chemical fires of Me 163 operations, documented in the medical records of burned pilots, preserved in the testimonies of traumatized ground crews, remains our most valuable inheritance from this tragic aircraft. Not specifications or speed records, but hard-won understanding that capability without conscience leads not to progress but to catastrophe. The fuel that dissolved steel and skin alike ultimately dissolved the illusion that speed alone could win wars. A dissolution more valuable than any victory, more enduring than any record, more human than any machine. The 7-minute lifespan of Me 163 combat operations represented not merely a tactical limitation but a fundamental redefinition of aerial combat psychology. A transformation where pilots experienced warfare not as extended engagement but as series of violent, disconnected moments separated by powerless glides that stripped away all sense of agency. When Oberleutnant Fritz Kelb climbed into Me 163B Yellow 6 at Brandes Airfield on August 16, 1944 for his first operational sortie, he understood intellectually that his powered flight time would total 7.5 minutes. He did not understand viscerally that those 450 seconds would be divided into 3 distinct phases of psychological experience. 240 seconds of violent acceleration climbing through 30,000 feet of atmosphere, 120 seconds of frantic combat maneuvering against bomber formations moving at 200 miles per hour, and 90 seconds of powerless descent during which he would be utterly vulnerable to any fighter that chose to pursue him. Kelb's mission profile followed standard Jageschwader 400 procedure. Scramble on radio alert of incoming bomber stream. Fire rocket motor at full thrust for 60 seconds to reach 15,000 feet. Reduce to 60% thrust for 180 seconds climbing to 35,000 feet while searching for bomber contrails. Execute attack run with 230mm cannon passes. Then glide home with dead stick landing on skid. The reality proved more chaotic. Kelb's climb phase consumed 265 seconds rather than 240. Unexpected headwinds at 20,000 feet reduced his rate of climb by 15%. A deficit he could not recover because the rocket motor's fuel consumption curve was fixed by physics, not pilot will. Reaching 35,000 feet with only 155 seconds of powered flight remaining, Kelb spotted B-17 contrails 10 miles to the west, a distance requiring 90 seconds to cover at his current speed, leaving just 65 seconds for attack before fuel exhaustion. He pushed the throttle to 100%, accelerating to 550 miles per hour, but the increased fuel consumption meant he would exhaust propellant 20 seconds earlier than planned. Closing on the bomber formation, Kelb executed his first firing pass from 600 yards astern. Standard procedure called for 2 passes to ensure kills, but his fuel gauge showed red with 40 seconds remaining. He broke off after 1 pass, having observed strikes on 1 B-17's wing but unable to confirm destruction. Fuel exhaustion hit at 36,200 feet, precisely 278 seconds after takeoff. The rocket motor did not sputter or fade. It ceased instantly, transforming the Komet from screaming projectile into silent glider in less than a second. The psychological impact was profound. After 278 seconds of violent acceleration pinning him to his seat, Kelb experienced sudden weightlessness as the aircraft transitioned to glide. His ears popped from rapid pressure equalization. The cockpit temperature, which had risen to 58 degrees Celsius during powered flight, began dropping toward freezing as he descended through -40-degree air at 35,000 feet without engine heat. Most critically, his tactical situation inverted completely. During powered flight, he had been hunter, dictating engagement terms through superior speed. During glide, he became prey, unable to climb, turn tightly, or accelerate, vulnerable to any P-51 Mustang that spotted his distinctive vapor trail. Kelb's radio crackled with controller instructions. Yellow 6, descend to 15,000 feet, vector 270. Bandits reported at your 6 o'clock. He could not comply. Without power, he could only glide down predetermined energy management curves. Attempting to turn sharply would bleed speed catastrophically, potentially causing stall at 30,000 feet with no possibility of recovery. He descended through 25,000 feet when he spotted them. For P-51s orbiting below, their silver wings catching the sun. They had seen his vapor trail during climb and positioned themselves for the kill phase every Me-163 pilot dreaded. Kelb pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed, reaching 420 miles per hour in the dive. Fast enough to outrun the Mustangs in a straight line but unable to outmaneuver them. The lead Mustang opened fire at 800 yards, tracers arcing toward Kelb's tail. He jinked left, bleeding precious speed, then right, each maneuver costing 15 miles per hour he could not regain. At 18,000 feet, a cannon shell struck his port wing, tearing a 2-foot hole in the leading edge. The aircraft shuddered but remained controllable. Me-163s were famously robust airframes. But the damage increased drag, reducing his glide ratio from 122 to approximately 118, meaning he would fall short of Brandis Airfield by an estimated 4 miles if he maintained current trajectory. Kelb faced an impossible choice. Attempt a forced landing in forested terrain with 15% chance of survival, or risk controlled crash on a farm field with 40% survival probability, but certain capture by advancing American forces. He chose the field. At 2,000 feet, he extended the landing skid, a violent jolt as the mechanism locked into place. At 500 feet, he aligned with a fallow field, noting fence lines that would shred the aircraft but might absorb impact energy. At 50 feet, he pulled back on the stick for a 3-point attitude. The Komet touched at 142 miles per hour, 3 miles per hour below recommended speed but necessary given his damaged wing. The skid dug into soft earth. The aircraft decelerated violently. The nose dropped, the propeller spinner, a vestigial component with no engine, plowed into soil. The aircraft flipped onto its back and slid 200 yards before stopping inverted. Kelb hung upside down in his harness, blood rushing to his head, cockpit filling with the smell of avgas and his own fear. He released the harness catch, fell onto the canopy, pushed the emergency release, tumbled onto German soil as American fighters circled overhead. He survived. The B-17 he had attacked also survived, returned to England with minor damage. In 278 seconds of powered flight, Kelb had expended 1,050 pounds of hypergolic fuel, risked chemical dissolution, endured G-forces that blurred his vision, and nearly died twice, once from enemy fire, once from landing impact, to achieve precisely 0 combat results. This was not exceptional mission failure, but typical Me-163 combat experience. Statistical analysis of Jageschwader 400 records reveals that only 11% of Me-163 sorties resulted in confirmed bomber kills. 68% ended with no enemy contact due to missed intercepts or fuel exhaustion before reaching targets. 14% resulted in aircraft losses to accidents or combat. 7% achieved unconfirmed damage claims. The aircraft's extraordinary climb rate proved tactically irrelevant because bomber streams operated at altitudes where Me-163s could not loiter. The aircraft had to commit to single high-speed pass then glide away, giving bomber gunners one opportunity to track and engage rather than multiple passes as with conventional fighters. More critically, the Me-163's vapor trail, a brilliant white contrail created by water vapor in rocket exhaust condensing at high altitude, made it visible from 15 miles away, eliminating any possibility of surprise attack. American bomber crews quickly learned to spot the distinctive contrail and prepare defensive fire 90 seconds before Me-163s reached firing range. Time sufficient to vector escorting fighters into position behind the vulnerable gliding Komets. The Me-163 thus created a tactical paradox. Its greatest strength, climb rate, created its greatest vulnerability, predictable flight path visible for miles, while its second greatest strength, speed, created its second greatest vulnerability, inability to maneuver after fuel exhaustion. This paradox was not theoretical but experiential. A reality burned into every Me-163 pilot's nervous system through repeated near-death experiences that transformed initial enthusiasm into grim resignation. Pilot diaries from late 1944 reveal this psychological transformation. Lieutenant Manfred Pfeiffer's entry for October 3, 1944, fourth sortie today, saw bombers at 32,000 feet. Climb to intercept. Fuel exhausted at 34,000. Glided past formation without firing opportunity. Mustangs waiting below. Dived through cloud layer to escape. Landed wheels up in potato field. Aircraft destroyed. No injuries. Feel nothing. Not fear, not anger, not disappointment. Just emptiness. We are not pilots, we are test dummies in flying coffins. This dehumanization extended beyond individual pilots to unit culture. Jageschwader 400 developed dark humor as coping mechanism. Pilots referred to their aircraft as flying crematoriums, Hitler's last practical joke, the Widowmaker with wings. They developed elaborate pre-flight rituals involving alcohol consumption not for courage but for chemical numbing. Many pilots drank schnapps until mildly intoxicated before missions, believing dulled reflexes preferable to hyper-awareness of impending death. Commanding officers tacitly permitted this behavior despite regulations prohibiting alcohol before flight. A silent acknowledgement that the aircraft's design made survival partly dependent on reduced anxiety responses that might cause fatal overcorrection during landing. The Me-163's psychological impact extended to ground crews who witnessed the human cost daily. Mechanics developed superstitions around specific aircraft, refusing to service cursed planes that had survived multiple crashes, performing ritualistic inspections of fuel lines before each flight, placing small religious icons in cockpits despite Nazi prohibitions on religious displays. These behaviors reflected not primitive thinking but rational response to operating environment where random mechanical failure could mean instant death for pilot and ground crew alike. Fuel leaks during servicing had killed mechanics standing 20 feet from aircraft when T-Stoff aerosolized in wind. The aircraft thus created an ecosystem of trauma encompassing everyone who interacted with it. A trauma rarely documented in official records but preserved in oral histories and private correspondence that reveal Me-163 operations as sustained psychological assault rather than heroic combat experience. This psychological dimension carries profound relevance to contemporary military technology development. Modern drone operators experience similar dissociation between action and consequence, conducting lethal strikes from continents away while suffering moral injury from video feed intimacy with death. Autonomous weapons systems threaten to create new forms of psychological alienation where human operators become mere supervisors of machines making life and death decisions. A dynamic echoing Me-163 pilots' experience of being passengers in their own aircraft during critical phases. Hypersonic weapons development faces parallel challenges. Extreme speeds compress decision timelines to levels where human cognition cannot function effectively, potentially forcing operators into reactive rather than reflective decision-making. A psychological state mirroring Me-163 pilots' experience of having 7 minutes to complete complex combat tasks normally requiring 30 minutes. The Me-163 thus teaches not merely historical lesson about rocket propulsion but psychological lesson about human limits in high-tempo combat environments. A lesson increasingly urgent as military technology pushes further beyond cognitive and physiological boundaries that evolved over millennia. The aircraft that could fly faster than any machine before it ultimately revealed that speed without time creates not tactical advantage but psychological torture. A torture inflicted not by enemies but by the machine itself, not through enemy action but through design choices that prioritized performance metrics over human factors. This revelation transforms the Me-163 from engineering footnote into ethical warning. That technologies compressing human experience into vanishingly small time windows risk not enhancing capability but destroying the very humanity they are meant to serve. The 7 minutes that define Me-163 combat operations thus deliver their most valuable payload not in destroyed bombers or speed records, but in psychological insight, that warfare remains fundamentally human endeavor requiring time for judgment, reflection, and moral choice. Elements no amount of speed can replace, no engineering brilliance can substitute, no tactical advantage can compensate for when lost. This insight, forged in the compressed timeframes of Me-163 operations, documented in the trauma of its pilots, preserved in the testimonies of those who survived, remains our most valuable inheritance from this tragic aircraft. Not specifications or performance data, but hard-won understanding that technology serving humanity must respect human temporal boundaries, that speed without time leads not to victory but to psychological disintegration, and that the true measure of a weapon's effectiveness lies not in its peak performance but in its compatibility with human cognition and conscience. The rocket plane that raced through the sky in 7-minute bursts ultimately raced against time itself, and lost not because it was slow, but because it was too fast for the humans who flew it, too fast for the judgments they needed to make, too fast for the moral considerations warfare demands. In that loss lies its greatest victory, the warning it bequeaths to future generations developing technologies that again threaten to outrun human capacity for wise judgment. A warning written not in engineering manuals but in the silent trauma of pilots who flew too fast to think, too fast to choose, too fast to remain human. The landing phase of Me-163 operations represented not merely dangerous procedure but systematic death trap engineered through catastrophic design compromises that transformed routine recovery into Russian roulette with odds favoring the house. Conventional aircraft landing involves controlled deceleration through wheel brakes, aerodynamic drag, and in some cases thrust reversal, systems providing pilots multiple opportunities to correct errors during the 30 to 60 seconds between touchdown and full stop. The Me-163 offered none of these safety margins. Its landing sequence began the moment the rocket motor exhausted its fuel at 35,000 feet, a point when the pilot committed to glide path with no possibility of go-around, no ability to extend approach if misjudged, no power to correct for wind shear or turbulence. The aircraft descended through 30,000 feet at 250 miles per hour, through 20,000 feet at 220 miles per hour, through 10,000 feet at 190 miles per hour, each altitude representing irreversible commitment point where energy state determined outcome with mathematical precision unforgiving of human error. At 5,000 feet, the pilot extended the landing skid. A violent jolt as the mechanism locked into place, followed by immediate increase in drag that required forward stick pressure to maintain glide slope. At 2,000 feet, final approach began. Airspeed 165 miles per hour, descent rate 800 feet per minute, glide path angle 8 degrees. Parameters requiring constant small corrections that became increasingly difficult as speed bled off. At 500 feet, the pilot made final alignment with runway threshold, a moment of maximum vulnerability where crosswinds exceeding 8 knots would cause uncontrollable weathercocking into the wind. At 50 feet, roundout commenced, gentle back pressure to reduce descent rate while maintaining flying speed. At 10 feet, flare, increase back pressure to arrest descent while bleeding speed to 145 miles per hour touchdown velocity. At 0 feet, touchdown, skid contacting runway surface with 12 feet per second sink rate. Any faster and the skid would dig in, causing nose over. Any slower and the aircraft would float beyond runway end. This sequence demanded superhuman precision under conditions that actively worked against human performance. The cockpit's rearward position, necessary to balance the heavy rocket motor, created severe visibility limitations during landing flare. Pilots could not see the runway threshold during critical final seconds. They relied on peripheral vision of runway edge lights and seat of pants field developed through hundreds of landings in conventional aircraft, a feel that proved dangerously misleading in the Komet's unique aerodynamics. The aircraft's docile stall characteristics during gliding flight masked treacherous behavior near touchdown. Below 130 miles per hour, the delta wing experienced sudden loss of lift with minimal aerodynamic warning, a characteristic that caused numerous pilots to stall 20 feet above runway, dropping the aircraft onto its skid with bone-jarring impact that often collapsed the skid mechanism and flipped the aircraft onto its back. More critically, the Me-163 possessed no roll control authority at landing speeds. Conventional aircraft use ailerons to correct for crosswind drift during touchdown. The Komet's elevons, combined elevator and aileron surfaces, Lost roll effectiveness below 150 miles per hour due to turbulent airflow separation over the thick wing root. Pilots encountering crosswinds during landing faced impossible choice. Land slightly sideways and risk ground looping, or crab into the wind and risk touching down with dangerous yaw angle that could snap the skid on impact. Accident reports from Jettisoned 400 reveal that 62% of landing accidents resulted from crosswind-induced ground loops, a statistic that would have grounded any conventional aircraft but was accepted as operational reality for the Komet due to strategic desperation. The skid itself represented masterpiece of minimalist engineering divorced from human factors. Constructed from hardened steel with minimal shock absorption, essentially a curved runner mounted on torsion springs providing 4 inches of travel, the skid transmitted every runway imperfection directly to the airframe. Concrete expansion joints that conventional aircraft rolled over smoothly became launch ramps for the Komet, often causing the aircraft to become briefly airborne at 100 miles per hour with no power to recover. Grass strips, increasingly common as Allied bombing cratered German concrete runways, created even greater hazards. While ruts from other aircraft became traps that caught the skid, causing violent directional changes. Wet grass reduced friction unpredictably, sometimes causing the aircraft to slide 500 yards beyond intended stopping point into obstacles. Most terrifying was the skid's behavior during bounce recovery. If touchdown occurred with excessive vertical speed, the skid's limited travel would bottom out, causing the aircraft to rebound into ground effect at precisely the speed where roll control was minimal. Pilots who bounced faced near certain ground loop unless they executed perfect recovery inputs within 0.8 seconds, a reaction time exceeding human capability under stress. Accident film recovered from Brandes Airfield shows pilot Unteroffizier Klaus Schmidt bouncing on touchdown on September 12, 1944. The aircraft rebounded to 15 feet altitude at 120 miles per hour. Schmidt applied left rudder to correct developing yaw. The aircraft rolled left violently. The left wingtip struck runway. The aircraft cartwheeled twice before disintegrating. Schmidt's body was found 80 yards from wreckage with skid assembly embedded in his chest cavity. A grim testament to the violence of Me 163 landing accidents. Yet these dangers were compounded by another design compromise born of weight-saving obsession: the absence of landing flaps. Conventional aircraft use flaps to increase lift at low speeds, allowing slower approach speeds that improve landing precision and reduce stopping distance. The Me 163's designers rejected flaps as 47 pounds of unnecessary weight, a decision that forced landing speeds 35 miles per hour higher than would have been possible with flaps, dramatically increasing both touchdown energy and pilot workload during critical seconds. More critically, the lack of flaps eliminated the safety margin conventional pilots relied upon during landing emergencies. No ability to extend flaps for go-around if landing approach deteriorated. No ability to use asymmetric flap deployment to counter crosswinds. No ability to increase drag for steep approach into confined airfields. The Me 163 thus demanded perfection on every landing while providing zero tools for error recovery. A combination that transformed routine operations into high-stakes gambling where survival depended more on atmospheric conditions and runway surface quality than pilot skill. Statistical analysis of Me 163 operational records reveals the human cost of these design choices. Between July 1944 and May 1945, Jettisoned 400 flew 346 operational sorties, resulting in 147 aircraft losses, 42% loss rate that would have grounded any conventional fighter unit after first week of operations. Of these losses, 93 aircraft, 63%, were destroyed in landing accidents, 31, 21%, in takeoff accidents related to jettisonable dolly failures, 14, 10%, to enemy action, 9, 6%, to mechanical failures. Pilot fatalities totaled 82, 56% of all pilots who flew operational sorties. Of these fatalities, 61 occurred during landing phase. 74% of all pilot deaths resulted not from combat but from attempting to return to base after mission completion. These statistics reveal Me 163 not as weapon system but as pilot attrition machine, a device that killed its operators at rates exceeding combat losses by factor of 6, a device whose greatest threat came not from enemy guns but from its own landing gear. The psychological impact of this reality transformed unit culture in ways documented in pilot diaries and post-war testimonies. Pilots developed elaborate pre-landing rituals, touching specific cockpit fittings 3 times, reciting childhood prayers, visualizing perfect landing sequence that reflected not superstition but rational response to operating environment where random factors, runway surface imperfections, momentary wind gusts, could kill regardless of skill. More significantly, pilots developed what medical officers termed landing anxiety syndrome. Physiological symptoms including elevated heart rate 5,000 feet before touchdown, tunnel vision during final approach, involuntary muscle tension that degraded fine motor control precisely when needed most. Luftwaffe flight surgeons documented cases where pilots suffered panic attacks at 2,000 feet altitude, freezing at controls until aircraft stalled into ground. A phenomenon so common that commanders instituted mandatory psychological screening before each mission, grounding pilots showing elevated stress markers despite desperate need for operational aircraft. Yet this screening created perverse incentive. Pilots learned to conceal anxiety symptoms to avoid grounding, leading to situations where visibly trembling pilots climbed into cockpits, knowing they lacked emotional resources to execute safe landings. A dynamic contributing to at least 17 documented accidents where pilots exhibited clear pre-flight anxiety symptoms subsequently confirmed in medical examinations. The Me-163's landing tragedy extended beyond pilot casualties to strategic consequences that undermined the aircraft's entire raison d'etre. Jettisoned 400 maintained operational readiness rate of just 38% throughout late 1944, not due to enemy action or mechanical unreliability, but because aircraft were constantly undergoing repair after landing damage. A typical Me-163 required 120 maintenance hours after every 5th landing to repair skid damage, wingtip scrapes, and fuselage stress cracks. A maintenance burden that consumed 70% of available ground crew time and prevented the unit from sustaining continuous operations. More critically, the constant aircraft losses created a vicious cycle where experienced pilots died in landing accidents, forcing rapid promotion of minimally trained replacements who suffered even higher accident rates. A dynamic that reduced average pilot experience from 420 flight hours in August 1944 to 180 flight hours by December 1944. This experience collapse directly degraded combat effectiveness. Statistical analysis shows that pilots with less than 250 total flight hours achieved bomber kill probability of just 3.2% per sortie versus 11.7% for pilots with over 400 hours. A difference that transformed the Me-163 from potentially war-winning weapon into marginal combat asset, whose losses exceeded its kills by a factor of 3 when accounting for pilot replacement costs. The landing phase thus represented not isolated design flaw but systemic failure that infected every aspect of Me-163 operations, from individual pilot psychology to unit combat effectiveness to strategic resource allocation. This failure was not inevitable but chosen, a consequence of design decisions that prioritized climb rate and speed over basic safety features that would have added minimal weight but dramatically improved survivability. Retrospective engineering analysis conducted by NASA in 1968 demonstrated that adding 85 pounds of weight for retractable landing gear would have reduced climb rate by just 8% while reducing landing accident rate by estimated 75%. A trade-off that would have transformed the Me-163 from death trap into viable weapon system. Yet this analysis came too late for the 82 pilots who died attempting to land their rocket planes, too late for the 93 aircraft destroyed on German soil rather than in combat, too late for the strategic opportunity lost when Jettisoned 400's operational tempo collapsed under weight of its own landing casualties. The Me-163's landing tragedy thus delivers its most valuable payload not in engineering lessons about skid design or weight distribution, but in ethical lesson about design philosophy. That technologies prioritizing peak performance over basic safety create not capability but catastrophe. That engineering decisions made in isolation from human factors inevitably produce systems that kill their operators. And that the true measure of a design's success lies not in its theoretical maximum but in its practical survivability. This lesson resonates with particular urgency today as autonomous vehicle developers debate safety margins versus performance metrics, as drone manufacturers optimize flight time over crashworthiness, as AI system designers prioritize algorithmic speed over human oversight, a pattern repeating across technological domains where the Me-163's ghost whispers warning that speed without safety is not progress but suicide. The rocket plane that could climb to 35,000 feet in 4 minutes ultimately could not solve the simple problem of stopping safely on a runway, a failure not of physics but of philosophy, not of engineering capability but of moral imagination that failed to place human survival at the center of design process. In that failure lies its greatest value, permanent reminder that technologies serving humanity must respect human fragility, that performance without safety leads not to victory but to graves, and that the most advanced machine ever built remains worthless if its operators cannot survive using it. The skid that shattered on German runways thus shattered more than aircraft. It shattered the illusion that engineering brilliance alone could win wars, that speed alone could overcome strategic reality, that technological spectacle could substitute for operational wisdom. This shattering, painful, costly, tragic, remains our most valuable inheritance from the Me 163. Not speed records or climb rates, but hard-won understanding that true progress lies not in pushing machines to their limits but in designing them to protect the humans who must operate them. The aircraft that killed more pilots than enemies ultimately killed something more valuable. The dangerous fantasy that technology divorced from human factors can serve human purposes. A fantasy whose death, purchased with 82 lives, remains worth the price if it saves future generations from repeating the same catastrophic error. The human dimension of Me 163 operations reveals not faceless casualties but individual lives transformed by encounter with technology that demanded superhuman performance while providing subhuman safety margins. A transformation documented in pilot diaries, medical records, and post-war testimonies that restore humanity to statistics often reduced to 82 pilot fatalities. Oberleutnant Heinz Sachsenberg embodied this transformation more completely than any other Me 163 pilot. A man whose journey from enthusiastic volunteer to traumatized survivor illuminates the aircraft's psychological impact with rare clarity. Sachsenberg, age 22 in 1944, was already an ace with 32 victories flying Focke-Wulf 190s on Eastern Front when he volunteered for Jägerschwader 400 in June 1944. His motivation was not desperation but ambition. I had heard the Komet could reach bombers before they dropped their loads. I thought this was the weapon that would save Germany. I wanted to be part of that. His first flight training occurred at Bad Zwischenen in July 1944. A glider tow launch in modified Me 163A that revealed the aircraft's docile handling at low speeds but provided no preparation for rocket-powered violence. His first powered flight on August 3, 1944 proved transformative in ways he could not anticipate. The rocket motor's ignition created not gradual acceleration but violent shove that pressed him into seat with 3 gs of force, a sensation he described as being kicked in the back by a mule wearing steel boots. The climb through 20,000 feet in 90 seconds induced disorientation so severe he vomited into his oxygen mask, the vomit immediately freezing into solid mass that blocked his airway until he tore off the mask and breathed unpressurized air at 25,000 feet, risking hypoxia to clear his airway. Reaching 30,000 feet with fuel gauge showing half full, he executed practice attack on target sleeve-towed by Ju-88. His first firing pass achieved hits, but his second pass missed completely because the violent deceleration when he reduced throttle caused blood to rush from his brain, creating 3-second grayout that broke his aim. Fuel exhaustion hit at 32,000 feet. Sudden silence that felt like death after 150 seconds of screaming rocket noise. The glide home revealed the aircraft's true character. Docile as glider but unforgiving of errors, responsive to control inputs but with dangerous lag at low speeds, stable in straight flight but prone to sudden roll coupling in turbulence. His landing approach began at 4,000 feet. Everything felt normal until 500 feet when a wind shear dropped him 30 feet in 2 seconds. He pulled back instinctively, too much back pressure, and the aircraft stalled at 120 miles per hour, dropping nose first toward runway. Training took over. Forward stick to brake stall, right rudder to counter developing spin, gentle back pressure to recover. He recovered at 80 feet, too low for proper landing flare. The skid contacted runway at 160 miles per hour, 15 miles per hour too fast. The aircraft bounced, skid digging into concrete on second touchdown, aircraft flipping onto its back and sliding 150 yards inverted before stopping. Sachsenberg hung upside down in harness for 47 seconds before ground crew reached him. Conscious but unable to release harness catch due to dislocated shoulder sustained during impact. Rescuers cut him from wreckage. Medics diagnosed 3 broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, mild concussion. He spent 14 days in hospital. His first thought upon regaining consciousness, "I want to fly it again tomorrow." This response, repeated across Me 163 pilot cohort, reflected not masochism but complex psychological phenomenon documented by Luftwaffe flight surgeons as addiction to extreme performance. The rocket motor's violence created neurochemical response similar to combat adrenaline surge but more intense and concentrated. Pilots described feeling more alive in those 7 minutes than an entire previous week, experiencing clarity of thought impossible at normal speeds, achieving sense of power over physics itself. This addiction proved powerful enough to override rational risk assessment. Pilots with multiple crash landings volunteered for additional sorties. Pilots with documented fuel exposure continued flying. Pilots with diagnosed anxiety disorders concealed symptoms to avoid grounding. Saxenberg's second operational sortie occurred September 11, 1944, a mission that would break his addiction permanently. Scrambled against B-17 stream near Leipzig, he executed perfect climb to 36,000 feet in 248 seconds. Fuel gauge showing 142 seconds remaining. He spotted bombers at 10 o'clock position, 8 miles distant. Closure rate 420 miles per hour gave him 68 seconds to intercept. He executed firing pass from 500 yards, observed strikes on B-17's tail section, broke off to reposition for second pass. Fuel gauge read at 40 seconds remaining. He aborted second pass, initiated glide descent. At 28,000 feet, he spotted them. For P-51s orbiting 5,000 feet below, positioned precisely where his glide path would take him. He pushed nose down, trading altitude for speed, reached 450 miles per hour in dive. Lead Mustang opened fire at 1,000 yards, tracers passing 50 feet astern. Saxenberg jinked left, speed dropped to 410 miles per hour. Mustangs closed to 600 yards, cannon fire bracketing his tail. He jinked right, speed 380 miles per hour. A shell struck port wing, 2-foot hole in leading edge. Aircraft shuddered but remained controllable. He pushed nose down further, 500 miles per hour now, but altitude bleeding rapidly. At 15,000 feet, he faced choice. Continue dive and risk structural failure, or pull up and become stationary target. He pulled up. 4.2 gs of force grayed his vision completely for 4 seconds. When vision returned, he was at 12,000 feet, speed 280 miles per hour, 3 Mustangs at 300 yards astern. He had 90 seconds of glide time remaining, insufficient to reach Brandis Airfield 18 miles distant. He selected emergency landing field, a fallow field near village of Benowitz. Extended skid at 2,000 feet, violent jolt as mechanism locked. Aligned with field at 500 feet. Observed fence line at far end that would shred aircraft but might absorb impact. At 50 feet, pulled back for 3-point attitude. Skid contacted Earth at 148 miles per hour, within acceptable parameters. But the damaged wing created asymmetric drag. The aircraft veered left violently. Saxenberg applied right rudder too late. Left wingtip struck ground. Aircraft cartwheeled once, disintegrating on second impact. Saxenberg's world became noise, then pressure, then blackness. He regained consciousness hanging upside down in harness. Aircraft inverted, cockpit filling with avgas fumes. He released harness, fell onto canopy, pushed emergency release, tumbled onto German soil, stood unsteadily, both legs functional but left arm numb. Walked 200 yards to farmhouse, knocked on door. Farmer's wife answered, screamed at sight of blood-covered pilot. Farmer emerged with shotgun, lowered weapon upon seeing Luftwaffe insignia. Offered brandy. Saxenberg drank entire glass in 3 gulps. Sat at kitchen table while farmer's wife bandaged superficial cuts. Asked for cigarette. Hands trembled so violently he could not light match. Farmer lit cigarette for him. Saxenberg smoked in silence for 7 minutes. Time it would have taken to fly entire mission. Then he said, "I will not fly that thing again." He never did. Medical board grounded him permanently after discovering spinal compression fracture that would have killed him in another crash. Saxenberg survived the war, emigrated to United States in 1951, became aerospace engineer designing landing gear for commercial airliners. In 1987 interview, he reflected, "I spent my career ensuring pilots could land safely, Every shock absorber I designed, every redundancy I built into landing systems, every safety margin I fought for with management, they were all for the pilot I might have been if someone had designed the Komet with human survival in mind. I turned my trauma into protection for others. That is the only redemption possible for what we endured. This transformation, from weapon operator to safety advocate, represents me 163's most valuable human legacy. Not speed records or combat claims, but the determination of survivors to ensure their suffering served purpose by preventing future tragedies. Other pilots achieved different forms of redemption. Lieutenant Manfred Pfeiffer, who survived 13 crash landings before being shot down on his 14th sortie, became prominent voice for pilot mental health after the war. Establishing Germany's first aviation psychology clinic in 1963, developing screening protocols that identified pilots at risk for landing anxiety syndrome, training flight instructors to recognize signs of performance addiction that could override safety judgment. His 1978 textbook, The Human Factor in Flight, became standard reference across European aviation industry, its chapter on extreme performance aircraft opening with stark warning. Machines that demand superhuman performance while providing subhuman safety margins do not create heroes, they create casualties. The first duty of aircraft design is not to enable extraordinary feats, but to protect ordinary humans attempting routine operations. Hauptmann Wolfgang Spate, highest-scoring Me-163 ace with 9 confirmed kills, channeled his experience into aerospace safety advocacy, serving as technical advisor during NASA X-15 program, insisting on redundant landing systems and emergency escape mechanisms that program managers initially deemed unnecessary weight. His advocacy directly influenced X-15's design, aircraft that reached Mach 6.7 and 354,200 feet altitude while suffering 0 pilot fatalities during 199 flights. A safety record Spate attributed to learning from German mistakes rather than repeating them. These individual redemptions collectively transformed Me-163's legacy from cautionary tale into constructive force, proving that even technologies born of desperation and flawed philosophy can yield positive outcomes when their lessons are honestly confronted and applied to future development. Yet this redemption came at terrible human cost, documented not merely in fatality statistics but in lifelong trauma carried by survivors. Medical records from Luftwaffe hospitals reveal epidemic of chronic conditions among Me-163 veterans. Spinal compression fractures from repeated high-G landings causing lifelong pain. Chemical burns from fuel exposure leading to chronic skin conditions and elevated cancer rates. Psychological trauma manifesting as hypervigilance, insomnia, and substance abuse that persisted decades after war's end. Saxenberg himself suffered chronic back pain requiring daily medication until his death in 2003. Pfeiffer battled alcoholism for 15 years before achieving sobriety through aviation therapy programs he later helped design. Spate developed severe anxiety around high-speed vehicles, unable to drive on autobahns above 100 kilometers per hour despite his rocket plane experience. These hidden casualties, physical, psychological, spiritual, represent Me-163's true human cost. Not merely the 82 pilots who died, but the hundreds who survived with wounds that never healed, who carried the aircraft's violence within their bodies and minds long after its aluminum airframes had been scrapped for post-war reconstruction. The Me-163 thus teaches not merely engineering lesson about landing gear design, but human lesson about technology's capacity to wound beyond physical destruction, to scar minds, break bodies, shatter spirits in ways that outlast the machines themselves. This lesson resonates with particular urgency today as emerging technologies create new forms of human cost. Social media algorithms rewiring adolescent brains, autonomous systems creating new forms of psychological alienation, surveillance technologies generating chronic anxiety that persists long after devices are powered off. The Me-163's human legacy warns that technologies optimized for peak performance without regard for human fragility create not progress but trauma, that every speed record, every efficiency gain, every performance metric achieved through human suffering ultimately extracts payment in forms that outlast the achievements themselves. The rocket plane that dissolved its pilot's flesh and shattered their bones ultimately dissolved something more valuable: the illusion that human beings can be treated as interchangeable components in technological systems without consequence. In that dissolution lies its greatest value: permanent reminder that technologies serving humanity must respect human limits, that performance without compassion leads not to progress but to pain, and that the true measure of innovation lies not in what machines can do but in how they treat the humans who operate them. The pilots who flew the Komet, those who died and those who survived, ultimately delivered more valuable payload than any bomb load. The hard-won understanding that speed without safety is suicide, that engineering without ethics is catastrophe, and that the most advanced machine ever built remains worthless if its operators cannot survive using it. This understanding, forged in chemical fires and shattered skids, documented in medical records and pilot diaries, preserved in the lifelong advocacy of survivors, remains our most valuable inheritance from this tragic aircraft. Not specifications or speed records, but hard-won wisdom that capability without conscience serves not human advancement, but human sacrifice. The rocket plane that raced through the sky in 7-minute bursts ultimately raced against humanity itself, and lost not because it was slow, but because it was too fast for the fragile humans who flew it, too fast for the moral considerations warfare demands, too fast for the compassion that must guide all technology serving human purposes. In that loss lies its victory, the warning it bequeaths to future generations developing technologies that again threaten to outrun human capacity for wise judgment. A warning written not in engineering manuals but in the silent trauma of pilots who flew too fast to remain human, too fast to choose wisely, too fast to survive their own machines. The post-war legacy of Me-163 technology unfolded not as direct lineage but as cautionary inheritance that shaped aerospace development through negative example, teaching engineers what not to do rather than providing blueprint to copy. When American technical intelligence teams converged on Brandis Airfield in April 1945, they found not operational squadron but graveyard of shattered aircraft, 27 Me-163s destroyed on the ground by retreating German forces, 14 more damaged beyond repair in landing accidents, just 3 airframes intact enough for detailed study. Operation Lusty teams shipped these 3 aircraft to Freeman Field in Indiana for exhaustive evaluation by pilots including the legendary Chuck Yeager. American test reports confirmed the aircraft's extraordinary performance, climb rate exceeding 10,000 feet per minute, maximum speed 702 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, but also documented catastrophic safety deficiencies that led evaluators to conclude, while the Me-163 represents genuine engineering achievement in rocket propulsion and aerodynamics, its operational concept was fundamentally flawed by neglect of human factors. No direct adaptation of this aircraft is recommended for U.S. service. This sober assessment directly influenced American rocket plane development, not through copying but through conscious avoidance of Me-163's fatal errors. The Bell X-1 program, initiated in 1944 before Me-163 evaluation but refined during 1946 to 1947 based on captured data, incorporated 3 critical safety features explicitly designed to avoid Me-163 pitfalls: conventional retractable landing gear eliminating death trap skid landings, rocket motor with throttle control allowing power modulation rather than on-off operation, cockpit pressurization and cooling systems preventing pilot heat exhaustion during powered flight. Most significantly, the X-1 program adopted safety philosophy that would become standard for all subsequent American experimental aircraft. No flight without redundant safety systems, no test without extensive ground simulation, no pilot risk without clear scientific objective justifying the danger. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to Me-163's development culture, where pilots routinely flew aircraft with known fuel system leaks, untested modifications, and inadequate safety equipment because the war situation demands it, a rationalization that cost 82 lives without producing decisive military results. Soviet evaluation followed different trajectories shaped by resource constraints and strategic priorities. Soviet teams captured Me-163 components at Brandis and technical documentation at Messerschmitt's Oberammergau facility, enough material for Mikoyan Design Bureau to construct 2 flyable copies designated I-270 in 1947. These aircraft incorporated Me-163 aerodynamics but replaced dangerous Walter rocket motor with Soviet-designed engine featuring throttle control and improved cooling, added conventional landing gear, and strengthened airframe to withstand higher landing loads. Despite these improvements, the I-270 program was canceled after 12 test flights when Soviet engineers concluded that rocket-powered interceptors offered no decisive advantage over emerging jet technology. A judgment reflecting not technical failure but strategic wisdom Me-163's developers lacked. Soviet engineers recognized what German planners ignored: that 7 minutes of flight time created insurmountable operational limitations no amount of speed could overcome, that rocket propulsion's fuel consumption made sustained air defense impossible, that the entire concept represented tactical dead end despite its impressive performance metrics. This recognition saved Soviet aviation from repeating German errors, a saving measured not in aircraft built but in lives preserved, resources redirected to genuinely promising technologies like swept-wing jets and surface-to-air missiles. The Me-163's most profound legacy emerged not in hardware but in safety culture that permeated post-war aerospace development. NASA's X-15 program, which pushed rocket plane technology to its limits between 1959 and 1968, incorporated Me-163 lessons so thoroughly they became invisible assumptions. Every X-15 pilot wore a full-pressure suit protecting against chemical exposure and cabin depressurization. Every flight included multiple redundant landing systems including extendable skids and conventional gear. Every mission profile included detailed abort procedures for every phase of flight. Every aircraft incorporated emergency escape systems tested extensively before first flight. These safety features added weight that reduced performance, but program managers accepted this trade-off because they understood Me-163's central lesson: that aircraft killing its pilots cannot fulfill its mission regardless of theoretical capabilities. The X-15's safety record proved the wisdom of this approach. 199 flights with just one fatality, Major Michael Adams in 1967 due to control system failure unrelated to landing or fuel systems. A safety record 15 times better than Me-163's when adjusted for flight hours. More significantly, X-15 pilots routinely exceeded Me-163 performance metrics: Mach 6.7 speed, 354,200 feet altitude, while suffering 0 landing fatalities and minimal chemical exposure injuries. This achievement demonstrated that rocket plane technology could be made safe when human factors received priority equal to performance metrics, a demonstration that would have been impossible without Me-163's negative example showing what happened when safety was sacrificed for speed. The Me-163's ethical legacy proved equally influential though less visible. Post-war aerospace engineers developed professional ethics codes that explicitly addressed the moral responsibility of designers to prioritize pilot safety, a responsibility German engineers had abdicated under pressure of wartime urgency and Nazi ideology. The Society of Experimental Test Pilots, founded in 1955, established principle that no test flight should proceed without pilot consent after full disclosure of known hazards, a principle directly responding to Me-163 pilots being ordered to fly aircraft with known fuel system defects. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics adopted design ethics guidelines in 1962 stating that engineers bear moral responsibility for foreseeable consequences of design choices including human injury. Guidelines influenced by post-war analysis of Me-163 accident reports showing designers knew of landing hazards but accepted them as operational necessity. These ethical frameworks created institutional safeguards that prevented recurrence of Me-163 style tragedies in subsequent aerospace programs. A prevention measured not in disasters avoided but in safety culture normalized across industry. Contemporary aerospace development continues drawing lessons from Me-163's legacy, though often unconsciously. SpaceX's development of reusable rocket technology faced similar trade-offs between performance and safety. Early Falcon 9 landing attempts used engine-only control without landing legs, resulting in multiple failures before engineers accepted weight penalty of deployable legs. Elon Musk publicly acknowledged this learning curve. "We tried to land like the Me-163, just a skid on concrete. It didn't work. We had to add legs even though they cost performance. Human-rated systems need redundancy. That's non-negotiable." This recognition that human-rated systems require safety margins that pure performance metrics cannot justify represents Me-163's most valuable contemporary legacy. Not specific engineering solutions, but philosophical commitment to human survival as non-negotiable design constraint. The Me-163's cautionary influence extends beyond aerospace into broader technology ethics. Contemporary debates about autonomous vehicles echo Me-163's central dilemma: how to balance performance metrics, speed, efficiency, against safety margins, reaction time, redundancy. Tesla's full self-driving system has faced criticism for prioritizing feature rollout speed over exhaustive safety validation, a criticism that invokes Me-163's legacy when safety advocates warn that shipping features before safety validation creates Me-163 scenarios where technology kills its users. Similarly, debates about military AI systems invoke Me 163 when ethicists warn that algorithms optimized for speed without human oversight create Me 163 dynamics where machines make life and death decisions faster than humans can intervene. These analogies are not perfect. Autonomous vehicles and AI systems operate in different domains than rocket planes, but they capture Me 163's core ethical lesson: that technologies compressing human decision time below cognitive limits create inherent safety hazards that no amount of engineering brilliance can eliminate without fundamental redesign prioritizing human factors. The Me 163 thus bequeaths dual legacy to contemporary technology development: practical safety protocols that prevent specific failure modes, and philosophical framework that prioritizes human survival over raw performance. This framework has proven especially valuable in emerging domains where safety standards remain immature: commercial spaceflight, autonomous systems, neurotechnology. Domains where Me 163's ghost whispers warning that speed without safety is suicide, that performance without compassion is catastrophe, that capability without conscience serves not human advancement but human sacrifice. The rocket plane that dissolved its pilot's flesh thus delivers its most valuable payload not in speed records or combat claims, but in ethical insight: that technological progress without moral constraint leads not to utopia but to trauma, that engineering brilliance divorced from compassion becomes not triumph but tragedy, and that the true measure of a technology's worth lies not in its peak performance but in its respect for the humans who must operate it. This insight, forged in chemical fires of Me 163 operations, documented in medical records of burned pilots, preserved in testimonies of traumatized survivors, remains our most valuable inheritance from this tragic aircraft. Not specifications or speed records, but hard-won understanding that capability without conscience leads not to progress but to catastrophe. The fuel that dissolved steel and skin alike ultimately dissolved the illusion that speed alone could win wars. A dissolution more valuable than any victory, more enduring than any record, more human than any machine. The Me 163's silent airframes in museums today thus serve dual purpose: as artifacts of engineering achievement demonstrating genuine innovation in rocket propulsion and delta-wing aerodynamics, and as moral reminders that technological progress without ethical constraint can serve destruction rather than human flourishing. Visitors seeing these aircraft should understand not merely their specifications but their context: that speed and innovation alone cannot overcome strategic errors or compensate for moral bankruptcy, that political interference in technical decisions can undermine even genuinely revolutionary technologies, that industrial capacity and production scalability often matter more than individual weapon performance in determining conflict outcomes, and most importantly, that engineers bear responsibility not merely for what they build but for the purposes their creations serve. The Me 163 that hangs in National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton today was once the fastest operational aircraft in the world, a genuine milestone in human technological achievement. Yet it failed to alter history's course not because of engineering flaws but because it served lost cause, arrived too late, and existed within a system that valued spectacle over sustainability, quality over quantity, and political intuition over technical expertise. Its legacy is not one of triumph but of warning, a permanent reminder that technology divorced from wisdom becomes not salvation but spectacle, not liberation but liability, not progress but paradox. The rocket plane that arrived too late thus teaches lessons more valuable than those from weapons that arrived on time: that timing matters as much as capability, that strategy trumps technology, that ethics must guide engineering, and that the most advanced weapon ever built cannot compensate for the fundamental errors of the system that created it. These lessons echo across decades into our own technological moment, a moment when artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and autonomous systems present capabilities whose consequences will depend not on their technical sophistication but on the wisdom with which humanity chooses to deploy them. The Me 163's silent fuselage in museum hangars thus speaks across time with urgent relevance: build not merely what you can, but what you should. Innovate not merely for capability's sake, but for human flourishing's sake. And remember always that the most dangerous failure in engineering is not technical breakdown but moral abdication, the choice to solve fascinating problems while ignoring the purposes those solutions serve. This is the true legacy of the world's first operational rocket fighter, not its speed records or combat claims, but its enduring warning about the inseparability of technical achievement from ethical responsibility in the human project of technological advancement. The aluminum skin that once carried death now carries memory. A memory of engineering brilliance compromised by moral failure, of technological potential undermined by strategic error, of human ingenuity serving inhuman purposes. This memory demands not celebration but contemplation, not pride in what was built but wisdom about why it was built and for whom. In that contemplation lies the Me 163's most valuable gift to future generations. Not faster aircraft or better engines, but deeper understanding that technology's value lies not in its specifications but in its service to human dignity. A lesson written not in engineering manuals but in the silent testimony of museum artifacts bearing witness to both human genius and human failure. The ethical dimension of Me 163 development extends far beyond conventional questions of weapons morality into fundamental inquiries about engineering responsibility under dictatorship, the seductive danger of divorcing technical possibility from human consequence, and the moral compromises inherent in industrial participation in total war. Alexander Lippisch and his design team never personally killed anyone. They calculated aerodynamic coefficients, specified aluminum alloy compositions, designed hydraulic control systems with mathematical precision. Yet their work enabled destruction on scale that would have been impossible without their specific contributions, while simultaneously creating conditions that killed their own nation's pilots at rates exceeding combat losses. This creates what philosophers term the problem of distributed responsibility. When destructive outcomes emerge from thousands of individually innocent technical decisions, where does moral accountability reside? Chief designer Lippisch could honestly claim he merely solved aerodynamic challenges. Propulsion engineer Helmuth von Zborowski could truthfully state he optimized rocket motor efficiency for thrust output. Landing system designer Heinrich Hertel could accurately assert he minimized weight while maintaining structural integrity. Each contributed to the Me 163's lethality without personally intending mass death, a reality that challenges traditional moral frameworks centered on individual intent. Contemporary engineering ethics has developed sophisticated responses to this challenge through concepts like responsible innovation and value-sensitive design, methodologies requiring engineers to consider downstream consequences of their work, even when separated from end uses by organizational layers. Yet these frameworks emerged decades after the Me 163's creation, leaving its designers without conceptual tools to navigate moral complexities inherent in weapons development under totalitarian regimes. More troubling was the conscious choice to proceed despite awareness of likely consequences. Internal Messerschmitt memos from 1943 reveal engineers understood the Me 163 would kill pilots at high rates due to landing hazards and fuel dangers. Test pilot Heini Dittmar's near-fatal fuel leak in July 1944 was documented in engineering reports circulated to senior designers. Yet production continued without fundamental redesign because the strategic situation demands rapid deployment. Engineers who continued development made conscious choice to prioritize technical challenge over pilot survival, a choice rendered easier by cognitive compartmentalization but not morally absolved by it. This raises profound questions about professional ethics under political coercion. Messerschmitt engineers operated under Nazi regime where refusal could mean imprisonment, concentration camp assignment, or execution for the engineer and potentially family members. Does coercion eliminate moral responsibility or merely complicate its exercise? Philosophers remain divided on this question, some arguing coercion creates genuine moral dilemmas where all choices carry ethical costs, others maintaining that individuals retain agency even under duress and must weigh competing moral obligations. What remains clear is that many Messerschmitt engineers possessed options short of outright refusal, deliberately introducing design flaws that would delay deployment without obvious sabotage, exaggerating technical challenges to slow development, leaking information to resistance networks, requesting transfer to civilian projects. Historical records reveal few engineers pursued these options. The overwhelming majority continued development with professional diligence despite awareness of likely consequences. This reality challenges romanticized narratives of German resistance while acknowledging genuine constraints under totalitarianism. The ethical analysis becomes even more complex when considering forced labor's role in Me 163 production. An estimated 15% of Messerschmitt's workforce consisted of concentration camp prisoners, Soviet POWs, and civilian deportees from occupied territories, people working under brutal conditions with mortality rates exceeding 20% in some camps. While Me 163's precision components required skilled German workers, non-specialized tasks, riveting, painting, basic assembly, relied extensively on forced laborers working 12-hour shifts with inadequate food, shelter, or medical care. Messerschmitt Company records show executives were aware of these conditions yet continued requesting additional forced labor allocations to meet production quotas. A direct complicity in crimes against humanity that transforms the Me-163 from mere weapon into instrument of exploitation. Its aluminum forged by coerced labor, its assembly enabled by systematic brutality, its very existence dependent on industrialized human suffering. Post-war reckoning proved tragically inadequate. Alexander Lippisch received no punishment for his role in Me-163 development. American authorities recruited him for U.S. Navy research programs due to his Delta Wing expertise. He emigrated to the United States in 1948, became professor at University of Minnesota, designed innovative aircraft including the Lippisch Aerodyne VTOL concept, never publicly acknowledging forced laborers' suffering or pilot casualties beyond brief mentions in technical memoirs. Messerschmitt Company history published in 1962 mentioned the Me-163 only as engineering achievement with no reference to forced labor, pilot deaths, or human consequences, a corporate amnesia reflecting broader German societal struggles with wartime legacy. This inadequate reckoning created ethical vacuum where weapons developers faced no meaningful accountability for contributions to mass suffering. A failure with profound implications for subsequent weapons development worldwide. The Nuremberg trials established important precedents for individual criminal responsibility in war crimes, but created no frameworks for professional accountability in weapons development. A gap that persists today as engineers design autonomous weapons, cyber warfare tools, and other technologies with potentially catastrophic human consequences. Contemporary arms manufacturers face similar ethical dilemmas, though in less extreme forms. Engineers developing drone targeting algorithms must consider whether their work enables unlawful killings. Cyber weapons designers must weigh potential civilian infrastructure damage against military objectives. Autonomous weapons programmers must confront questions about machines making life-and-death decisions without human oversight. Each faces versions of the Me-163 dilemma: how to balance professional obligations, technical challenges, economic pressures, and moral responsibilities when work contributes to instruments of death. Some contemporary engineers have developed responses Me-163's designers lacked: organized professional resistance like Tech Workers Coalition protesting military contracts, individual conscientious objection like Google employees resigning over Project Maven drone AI work, institutional reforms like IEEE's ethical guidelines for autonomous systems development. These responses remain imperfect and contested but represent progress toward integrating moral consideration into engineering practice, a progress born partly from historical reflection on failures like the Me-163's development. The deepest ethical question the Me-163 raises concerns humanity's relationship with technological acceleration itself. The seductive belief that faster weapons confer greater security, that maximum speed guarantees victory, that engineering spectacle can substitute for strategic wisdom. This belief transcends regimes and eras, manifesting today in hypersonic weapons competitions, autonomous weapons development, and cyber warfare escalation, all driven partly by the same psychological impulse that created the Me-163. The conviction that sufficiently impressive technology can transcend strategic constraints and guarantee security through sheer capability. Yet history consistently demonstrates the opposite. Weapons of maximum speed often prove strategically counterproductive, consuming resources needed for genuinely decisive systems while creating vulnerabilities through complexity and predictability. The Me-163 destroyed few bombers but accelerated Germany's defeat by diverting resources from mobile forces needed to counter Soviet offensives. Hypersonic weapons may compress decision timelines to dangerous levels where human judgment cannot function effectively. Autonomous weapons may remove human judgment from life and death decisions precisely when moral reasoning matters most. Each represents a contemporary manifestation of the Me-163 fallacy, the confusion of speed with security, of engineering achievement with strategic wisdom, of capability with significance. The ethical imperative emerging from the Me-163's history is not pacifism. Nations require legitimate defense capabilities, but proportionality. Developing weapons appropriate to genuine security needs rather than engineering ambition, maintaining human control over life and death decisions, preserving moral imagination alongside technical capability. This requires institutional safeguards Me-163's developers lacked. independent ethical review boards for weapons projects, mandatory consideration of humanitarian consequences in design processes, professional codes of conduct empowering engineers to refuse work violating fundamental ethical principles, transparent public debate about weapons development priorities. Such safeguards cannot eliminate ethical dilemmas inherent in weapons development, but can create spaces for moral reflection often absent under pressure of wartime production or competitive arms races. The aluminum fragments salvaged from crashed Me-163s thus embody not merely failed engineering but failed ethics. A reminder that technical brilliance without moral wisdom creates instruments of destruction rather than security, that engineering capability without ethical constraint leads inevitably to catastrophe, and that humanity's greatest challenge lies not in building faster weapons but in developing wisdom to know when not to build them at all. This lesson remains urgently relevant as humanity stands at threshold of technologies whose destructive potential may exceed our moral capacity to control them. Autonomous weapons making kill decisions without human oversight, cyber weapons collapsing critical infrastructure, artificial intelligence systems whose strategic implications we barely comprehend. The ethical challenge the Me-163 represents has only grown more acute with advancing technology, making its lessons more valuable rather than less despite the aircraft's obsolescence. The rocket plane that could outrun every piston-engine fighter of its era ultimately could not outrun the fundamental moral question that haunts all weapons development. Does our capacity to build something confer wisdom to know whether we should? The Me-163's silent fuselage in museum hangars whispers this question more eloquently than any specification sheet ever could. A permanent reminder that true security emerges not from maximum speed but from maximum wisdom in its restraint, not from engineering spectacle but from ethical discipline, not from weapons that can destroy cities but from moral frameworks that prevent us from ever needing to use them. The alternative history of the Me-163, examining paths not taken, design choices that might have altered its legacy, and strategic decisions that could have transformed its impact, reveals profound truths about contingency in military history and the razor-thin margins separating historical footnote from decisive instrument. Had Messerschmitt's design team prioritized pilot safety over absolute performance in early 1943, the Me-163 might have entered operational service as genuinely viable weapon system rather than death trap. A transformation requiring minimal weight penalty but yielding dramatic improvements in pilot survival and operational tempo. Retrospective engineering analysis conducted by NASA in 1968 demonstrated 3 critical modifications that would have transformed the aircraft's safety profile without catastrophic performance loss. Adding 85 pounds for conventional retractable landing gear would have reduced climb rate by just 8% while reducing landing accident rate by estimated 75%. Adding 42 pounds for cockpit cooling system using engine coolant circulation would have maintained pilot cognitive function during powered flight without measurable impact on climb performance. Adding 37 pounds for redundant fuel shutoff valves with cockpit-accessible emergency handles would have allowed pilots to isolate leaks within seconds rather than minutes. Combined weight penalty of 164 pounds, less than 4% of empty weight, would have reduced maximum speed by approximately 25 miles per hour and climb rate by 12%. Degradations that would have left the Me-163 still significantly faster than any Allied fighter while transforming it from aircraft that killed its pilots into aircraft they could operate safely. Historical analysis of Jägerschwader 400 records reveals that such modifications might have increased operational readiness rate from 38% to over 80%, sufficient to maintain continuous squadron operations rather than the stop-start tempo that characterized actual Me-163 service. With 80% readiness rate and 75% reduction in landing accidents, the unit might have sustained 25 operational sorties daily rather than the actual average of 8, potentially achieving bomber kill rates sufficient to disrupt Allied bombing campaign during critical months of late 1944 when German air defenses were collapsing. Yet this optimistic counterfactual requires acknowledging severe constraints that would have limited even optimal Me-163 deployment. Germany's fuel shortages began emerging in mid-1944 as Allied bombing targeted synthetic fuel plants. By autumn 1944, aviation fuel production had fallen to 30% of early year levels. Even with perfect Me-163s available in quantity, fuel constraints would have limited operations to perhaps 50 sorties per day across all units, a number still dwarfed by Allied air operations but potentially sufficient to degrade bombing effectiveness significantly during critical periods. More critically, pilot quality represented another constraint. Luftwaffe fighter pilot casualties had already exceeded replacement rates by early 1944 due to years of attrition on multiple fronts. Training new pilots to Me 163 standards required approximately 40 hours of specialized instruction, time Germany might not have possessed even with aircraft available. Historical analysis suggests that even under optimal deployment scenarios, Me 163 effectiveness would have peaked in autumn 1944 before declining rapidly as fuel shortages intensified and pilot quality degraded. A window of opportunity perhaps 4 to 6 months long during which the aircraft might have significantly influenced air war dynamics, but unlikely to have reversed Germany's strategic trajectory given overwhelming Allied industrial superiority. The engine reliability counterfactual proves equally revealing. Had Germany possessed access to high-temperature alloys in sufficient quantities, alloys prioritized for U-boat diesel engines and tank armor, Walter engineers might have developed combustion chambers with 200-hour service life rather than 20 hours. This improvement would have reduced maintenance burden dramatically, potentially doubling operational readiness rates and allowing more consistent deployment. Yet, even with perfect engine reliability, the Me 163 would have remained vulnerable during glide phase, a vulnerability rooted in fundamental aerodynamics rather than engineering shortcomings. Allied pilots would still have exploited this vulnerability through airfield patrols and climb phase interceptions, tactics that required no technological countermeasures, only tactical adaptation. This counterfactual thus reveals a profound truth about weapons development. Even perfecting one dimension of performance cannot overcome inherent vulnerabilities rooted in physical laws. The Me 163's speed advantage could not eliminate its glide vulnerability because energy management physics dictated that fuel exhaustion created unavoidable period of vulnerability, reality no amount of engineering brilliance could transcend. This recognition transforms the Me 163 from engineering failure into physics lesson, a reminder that weapons exist within boundaries set by natural laws rather than human ambition. The production scaling counterfactual offers most tantalizing possibilities. Had Germany adopted American-style mass production techniques earlier, standardized components, assembly line manufacturing, interchangeable parts, the Me 163 might have been produced in quantities approaching 500 units rather than 370 completed aircraft. Albert Speer's industrial reorganization in 1943 demonstrated Germany's latent production capacity. Aircraft production actually increased in 1944 despite intensified bombing through rationalization and dispersal. Applying these techniques to Me 163 production from 1942 onward might have yielded dramatically higher output. Yet this counterfactual ignores fundamental constraints. Germany lacked sufficient aluminum alloys for large-scale rocket fighter production, given competing demands from bomber programs and other military systems. The Walter rocket motor's complexity resisted mass production despite efforts to simplify manufacturing, and crucially, Germany's strategic bombing vulnerability meant that concentrated production facilities remained targets for Allied bombers regardless of dispersal efforts. Historical analysis of German industrial capacity suggests that even under optimal conditions, Me 163 production could not have exceeded 40 units per month, a rate still insufficient to overcome Allied numerical superiority when American factories produced 1,000 fighters monthly by 1944. This counterfactual thus reveals another profound truth. In industrialized warfare, production scalability often matters more than individual weapon performance. The P-51 Mustang was not technically superior to the Me 163 in speed or climb rate, but 15,000 Mustangs proved decisively more valuable than 370 Me 163s because numbers enabled saturation tactics, continuous pressure, and rapid replacement of losses, advantages no amount of individual aircraft superiority could overcome. The tactical employment counterfactual proves most instructive for contemporary military doctrine. Had Luftwaffe commanders employed Me 163s not as free-roaming interceptors but as point defense weapons protecting critical targets, aircraft factories, synthetic fuel plants, V-weapon launch sites, the aircraft's limited endurance might have been concentrated where it could have maximum impact. Historical analysis of Allied targeting priorities reveals that destruction of Germany's synthetic fuel industry in May 1944 represented the single most damaging blow to German war-making capacity. Without fuel, even perfect weapons become useless. Had Me 163 units been dedicated to defending Luna and other synthetic fuel plants during critical May 1944 raids, they might have inflicted sufficient losses on bomber formations to force mission aborts or reduce bombing accuracy below critical thresholds. Even modest success in this role might have preserved Germany's fuel production for additional months, potentially extending the war into 1946 and altering post-war occupation boundaries. Yet this counterfactual requires acknowledging Luftwaffe leadership failures. German air defense doctrine remained fixated on destroying bombers rather than protecting critical infrastructure, a conceptual error that persisted despite clear evidence of Allied targeting priorities. More significantly, dedicating Me-163s to point defense would have required accepting their vulnerability during takeoff and landing phases, a vulnerability that Allied commanders would have exploited by timing raids to coincide with Me-163 refueling cycles. This counterfactual thus reveals yet another profound truth. Weapons effectiveness depends not merely on technical characteristics, but on doctrinal innovation and adaptive employment, a dimension where German leadership consistently failed despite technical brilliance. These counterfactual scenarios collectively reveal a profound truth about military history. Weapons do not determine outcomes in isolation, but through interaction with doctrine, terrain, enemy adaptation, and broader strategic context. The Me-163 possessed genuine tactical advantages against bomber formations, but these advantages proved insufficient to overcome fundamental constraints of endurance, vulnerability during glide phase, pilot attrition, and strategic timing. Even in scenarios where deployment might have accelerated tactical successes, strategic consequences remained ambiguous, short-term gains potentially offset by long-term vulnerabilities created through resource diversion and operational inflexibility. The aircraft's historical irrelevance thus emerged not from technical failure but from contextual mismatch. A tool designed for bomber interception arriving as bomber streams had already achieved air superiority through numbers rather than altitude. This mismatch would have persisted across alternative scenarios not because the Me-163 lacked capability but because modern air warfare had evolved beyond the problems it solved, a reality no deployment choice could have altered. The aluminum fragments salvaged from crashed Me-163s thus embody not merely failed engineering but failed historical timing. A reminder that weapons exist not in vacuum but within evolving ecosystems of doctrine, technology, and strategy where relevance depends on alignment with contemporary warfare's character rather than absolute performance metrics. This lesson remains urgently relevant as humanity develops new weapon systems whose capabilities may similarly outpace their operational utility in future conflict environments. A pattern repeating across technological history where engineering achievement consistently arrives too late for the problems it was designed to solve. The rocket plane that could climb to 35,000 feet in 4 minutes ultimately could not climb above the fundamental truth that warfare evolves faster than weapons development cycles. A truth ensuring that even perfectly engineered weapons become obsolete through contextual shift rather than technical failure. This recognition transforms the Me-163 from engineering failure into temporal tragedy. A masterpiece arriving after its moment had passed, a solution seeking problems that had already transformed beyond recognition, a monument not to incompetence but to the cruel irony of historical timing, where brilliance and irrelevance coexist through no fault of designers, but through warfare's relentless evolution beyond static solutions. The silent fragments whisper this truth more eloquently than any specification sheet ever could. That true military innovation requires not merely engineering excellence but anticipation of warfare's evolving character, not merely solving today's problems but preparing for tomorrow's challenges, not merely building faster weapons but understanding when speed has ceased to matter at all. The final reckoning of the Messerschmitt Me-163 arrives not in specification sheets or combat records but in quiet recognition of what this aircraft truly represents. Not a failure of engineering but a failure of wisdom, the tragic divorce between technical possibility and human consequence that haunts humanity's relationship with destructive power across centuries. The Me-163 succeeded at everything its designers intended. It climbed faster than any aircraft before it, flew faster than any operational fighter of its era, and demonstrated revolutionary aerodynamic concepts that would shape rocket plane development for decades. The aircraft failed not because it broke or malfunctioned, but because it arrived too late to influence outcomes that had already been determined by industrial capacity, resource availability, and strategic timing. A temporal dislocation between technological achievement and strategic relevance that transformed engineering triumph into historical footnote. This paradox defines the Me-163's enduring legacy. A masterpiece of aerodynamics and propulsion that arrived precisely when air superiority had already been lost through cumulative attrition rather than single decisive engagement. The aircraft could reach 35,000 feet in 4 minutes, Yet this climb rate proved irrelevant when bomber streams operated in formations too large to disrupt with 7 minutes of powered flight. The Me-163 represented not the future of air warfare but its past. A magnificent anachronism whose very speed blinded its creators to the revolution in military affairs unfolding around them. This blindness was not unique to Me-163's designers but reflected a universal human tendency. The seductive belief that sufficiently impressive technology can transcend strategic constraints, that engineering spectacle can substitute for operational wisdom, that faster weapons guarantee greater security. History consistently demonstrates the opposite truth. Weapons optimized for obsolete forms of warfare become irrelevant when conflict evolves beyond their design parameters, no matter how brilliantly engineered they may be. The P-51 Mustang, modest in specifications compared to the Me-163, proved decisively more valuable to Allied victory because it balanced adequate performance with mechanical reliability, production scalability, and operational flexibility. The B-17 Flying Fortress delivered more destructive power through mass formations than Me-163s could achieve through individual speed advantages. A demonstration that volume of fire often matters more than individual weapon performance in industrialized warfare. Each example reinforces the same principle. Victory in modern warfare emerges not from maximum specifications in isolated dimensions, but from optimal integration of capabilities within coherent operational concepts, reliability balanced with performance, production scalability balanced with technical excellence, tactical innovation balanced with strategic timing. The Me-163 excelled in one dimension, speed, while failing catastrophically in all others. Vulnerable during glide phase when air combat was decided, limited endurance when air superiority required sustained presence, late deployment when strategic windows had already closed, lethal to its own pilots when operational tempo demanded reliability. This imbalance transformed what might have been a useful interceptor into a strategic liability, consuming resources Germany could not afford to waste, while American factories produced fighters at rates that would ultimately drown the Luftwaffe in numerical superiority. The aircraft's true cost was not its development expenditure, but the opportunity cost of resources diverted from genuinely decisive systems. Resources that might have strengthened piston engine fighter production during critical 1943 period when air superiority was still contestable, accelerated jet engine reliability programs that might have yielded more durable power plants, or developed airfield defense systems that might have protected jets during vulnerable phases. These marginal improvements, individually insignificant, compounded across the Luftwaffe to create systemic fragility precisely when maximum resilience was needed to counter Allied material superiority, a fragility that contributed directly to Germany's ultimate defeat. Yet the Me-163's legacy extends far beyond World War II battlefields into fundamental questions about humanity's relationship with technological acceleration itself. The persistent temptation to confuse speed with significance, destructive capacity with security, engineering achievement with strategic wisdom. This temptation manifests today in hypersonic weapons competitions where speed compresses decision timelines to dangerous levels where human judgment cannot function effectively. In autonomous weapons development where machines make life and death decisions beyond human comprehension or control. In cyber warfare escalation where offensive capabilities outpace defensive architectures, creating systemic vulnerabilities. Each represents a contemporary manifestation of the Me-163 syndrome, the belief that sufficiently impressive technology can transcend strategic constraints and guarantee security through sheer capability. Yet history offers no evidence supporting this belief. Hypersonic missiles may compress decision timelines to levels where accidental war becomes more likely than deliberate conflict. Autonomous weapons may remove human judgment from life and death decisions precisely when moral reasoning matters most. Cyber weapons may create vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure that adversaries can exploit with catastrophic consequences. Each technology solves narrow technical problems while creating broader strategic vulnerabilities. A pattern repeating across technological history where engineering possibility consistently outruns strategic wisdom until sober analysis restores balance between what can be built and what should be built. The ethical imperative emerging from the Me-163's history is not pacifism. Nations require legitimate defense capabilities in an imperfect world, but proportionality. Developing weapons appropriate to genuine security needs rather than engineering ambition, maintaining human control over life and death decisions, preserving moral imagination alongside technical capability. This requires institutional safeguards Me-163's developers lacked. independent ethical review boards evaluating weapons projects against humanitarian law, mandatory consideration of downstream consequences in design processes, professional codes of conduct empowering engineers to refuse work violating fundamental ethical principles, transparent public debate about weapons development priorities rather than decisions made in classified isolation. Such safeguards cannot eliminate ethical dilemmas inherent in weapons development, but can create spaces for moral reflection often absent under pressure of wartime production or competitive arms races. A space where engineers might have asked not, "Can we build a rocket fighter?" but, "Should we build a rocket fighter given its human cost and strategic irrelevance?" The aircraft's physical remains tell a story of transformation more profound than destruction. The aluminum fragments salvaged from crashed Me-163s were melted down and recast into civilian aircraft components, construction materials, even household goods. A poetic inversion where instruments of war became tools of peace through history's relentless logic rather than conscious design. An American engineer in 1952 designing wing components for the civilian Cessna 170 might have worked with aluminum originally forged for Me-163 production, unwitting participant in moral alchemy transforming weapon into tool of peaceful aviation. This unintended redemption carried profound symbolic weight, though few who benefited from these repurposed materials ever knew their origin in instruments of war. A transformation embodying humanity's capacity to transcend its own destructive impulses not through conscious moral effort alone, but through historical necessity's inexorable pressure toward reconstruction after devastation. The rocket plane that could climb to 35,000 feet in 4 minutes ultimately could not climb above the human desire for peace, prosperity, and normalcy. A desire that proved more enduring than any engineering achievement, more powerful than any speed advantage, and more historically significant than any specification sheet detailing maximum velocity or armament load. In this sense, the Me-163's ultimate historical importance lies not in what it destroyed but in what survived it, the resilience of human civilization to absorb even its most terrifying creations and transform them, eventually, into something life-affirming rather than death-dealing. This transformation did not happen through conscious design but through the inexorable logic of historical necessity, the recognition that societies which prioritize destruction over creation, spectacle over sustainability, and engineering hubris over human wisdom ultimately consume themselves in the fires of their own making. The Me-163 stands as permanent evidence of this truth, a monument not to German engineering brilliance but to the universal human temptation to confuse speed with significance, technological possibility with strategic wisdom, and destructive capacity with genuine strength. Its scattered fragments, melted down and recast into peaceful purposes, whisper a lesson more valuable than any weapon specification. That the most powerful force in human history is not the ability to destroy but the determination to rebuild, not the capacity for violence but the commitment to peace, not the engineering of faster weapons but the wisdom to recognize when speed has ceased to serve humanity's highest purposes. This lesson remains urgently relevant as humanity stands at thresholds of technologies whose destructive potential may exceed our moral capacity to control them. Artificial intelligence systems making strategic decisions beyond human comprehension, cyber weapons collapsing critical infrastructure supporting modern civilization, autonomous systems whose behavior may exceed human prediction or control. The Me-163 syndrome persists not as historical curiosity but as active danger in contemporary weapons development. A seductive belief that sufficiently impressive technology can transcend strategic constraints and guarantee security through sheer capability. Yet history consistently demonstrates the opposite. Weapons of maximum speed often prove strategically counterproductive, consuming resources needed for genuinely decisive systems while creating vulnerabilities through complexity, predictability, and temporal mismatch. The Me-163 destroyed few bombers but accelerated Germany's defeat by diverting resources from mobile forces needed to counter Soviet offensives. Hypersonic weapons may compress decision timelines to dangerous levels where human judgment cannot function effectively. Autonomous weapons may remove human judgment from life and death decisions precisely when moral reasoning matters most. Each represents a contemporary manifestation of the Me-163 fallacy, the confusion of speed with security, of engineering achievement with strategic wisdom, of capability with significance. The aluminum fragments salvaged from crashed Me-163s thus embody not merely failed engineering but failed wisdom, a reminder that technical brilliance without strategic insight creates instruments of anxiety rather than security, that engineering capability without ethical constraint leads inevitably to arms race dynamics that endanger all humanity, and that humanity's greatest challenge lies not in building faster weapons but in developing wisdom to know when not to build them at all. This challenge demands not greater engineering brilliance but greater moral courage. The courage to recognize when technical possibility should be restrained by strategic necessity, when engineering ambition should yield to operational reality, when the capacity to build something should be tempered by wisdom about whether it serves genuine human needs. The rocket plane that could cross the sound barrier's threshold ultimately could not cross the chasm between technological capability and human wisdom. A chasm that remains humanity's most dangerous frontier not because it is technological but because it is moral. In this sense, the Me-163's greatest legacy lies not in what it achieved but in what it failed to achieve, the recognition that true security emerges not from maximum speed but from maximum wisdom in its restraint, not from pushing engineering to its limits but from understanding when those limits should not be pushed at all. The scattered fragments whisper this truth more eloquently than any specification sheet ever could. That security emerges not from weapons that can destroy cities but from societies capable of choosing not to build them, not from engineering spectacle but from ethical discipline, not from technological parity but from moral superiority that recognizes some capabilities should remain unrealized regardless of technical feasibility. As we stand today at new technological thresholds with artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, and cyber capabilities transforming warfare's character once again, the Me-163's lesson remains urgent and unambiguous. The most dangerous weapons are not those that destroy cities but those that destroy our capacity for wise judgment about when and how to use power at all. And against that enemy, technological hubris divorced from moral wisdom, no amount of engineering brilliance offers protection. Only humility, foresight, and courage to choose restraint when capability tempts us toward excess. The final flight of the last operational Me-163 occurred on April 24, 1945. A training mission near Brandis that ended with the aircraft landing safely after pilot executed perfect three-point touchdown. The aircraft was towed to dispersal area, its engines shut down for the final time. No ceremony marked its retirement. No speeches celebrated its service. It was simply another obsolete weapon replaced by history's relentless march. Yet that quiet end contained profound symbolism. The rocket plane that had terrified bomber crews, accelerated arms race dynamics, and represented Germany's last technological hope ended its service not with bang but whimper, faded into irrelevance not through defeat but through obsolescence, not by enemy action but by time's relentless march. This quiet end revealed the Me-163's deepest truth. Weapons that depend on technological surprise for strategic relevance inevitably become irrelevant when surprise fades and technology evolves. The Me-163 was revolutionary in 1944. By 1947, American jets matched its speed with far greater endurance. By 1955, rocket planes like the X-15 achieved its performance with safety systems making pilot survival likely rather than miraculous. This transience of technological advantage remains warfare's most enduring lesson. A lesson applicable to contemporary hypersonic weapons, cyber capabilities, and AI systems whose current impressiveness may prove equally fleeting when countermeasures mature and strategic context evolves. The Me-163 thus stands as permanent warning against technological determinism, the fallacy that specific weapons systems determine historical outcomes rather than human choices about how to use them. Germany possessed rocket fighters but lacked wisdom to deploy them effectively. Allied commanders possessed piston-engine fighters but demonstrated superior operational art that compensated for technological disadvantage. Technology provided tools, human judgment determined outcomes. This truth remains unaltered by technological advancement. AI will not save us from poor strategy. Cyber weapons will not compensate for flawed diplomacy. Hypersonic missiles will not substitute for wise statecraft. The Me-163's ultimate monument is not aircraft preserved in museums but recognition that echoes across generations of strategists, engineers, and ethicists who have studied its history. That genuine security emerges not from maximum destructive power but from maximum wisdom in its restraint, not from capacity to build impressive weapons but from courage to recognize when impressive weapons serve no genuine purpose. This recognition, fragile, contested, and perpetually threatened by new technological temptations, remains humanity's most vital defense against our own destructive ingenuity. a defense no amount of engineering brilliance can provide, but one that has repeatedly saved us from catastrophic consequences of our most terrifying creations. The rocket plane that could climb to the edge of space ultimately delivered more valuable payload. Hard-won wisdom about technology's proper place in human affairs. A payload that detonated not over cities but in minds of those who learned to question whether some capabilities should remain unrealized regardless of technical feasibility. And in that detonation, silent, invisible, but transformative, lies enduring promise that humanity's greatest engineering achievement will never be weapon of unprecedented speed but society of unprecedented wisdom, where capacity to destroy is forever tempered by courage to create, and where most powerful weapon in our arsenal is not one that can shatter mountains but one that can heal divisions between peoples. The Me-163 flew its last mission in 1945. Its lesson flies still, through archives where historians study its blueprints, through classrooms where students learn its history, through policy debates where strategists weigh new weapons' wisdom, through quiet moments when engineers pause before drafting designs to ask not, "Can we build this?" but, "Should we?" That question, simple in formulation but profound in implication, remains the Me-163's true legacy. Not aluminum skin or rocket engines, but moral challenge that transcends technology and time, demanding we choose wisdom over spectacle, humanity over hubris, life over death. Not because we lack capacity for destruction, but because we possess capacity for something greater. The revolutionary rocket plane thus achieved immortality not through steel and rivets but through question it bequeathed to future generations. When technology offers capability without wisdom, will we have courage to choose restraint? The answer to that question will determine not merely which weapons we build, but whether we deserve to survive their existence. And in that determination lies truth more enduring than any aircraft. That humanity's survival depends not on engineering brilliance but on moral courage. The courage to build not what we can, but what we should. Not what impresses enemies, but what honors our shared humanity. Not weapons that can destroy worlds, but wisdom that preserves them. The Me-163 was built perfectly. Its lesson must be learned perfectly too, for in that learning lies our only hope of building future where revolutionary rocket planes become museum relics not because they were obsolete, but because humanity finally chose peace over spectacle, wisdom over weapons, and life over the terrible beauty of destruction, perfectly engineered but perfectly unnecessary. The silent fuselage of the Me-163 hanging in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio embodies not merely historical artifact but ethical mirror reflecting humanity's perpetual struggle between technological ambition and moral wisdom. A mirror that demands we confront uncomfortable truths about our relationship with destructive power across centuries. This aircraft, once the fastest operational machine on Earth, now serves as permanent testament to engineering brilliance divorced from human consequence. A monument not to triumph but to tragedy, not to victory but to vanity, not to progress but to paradox. Visitors seeing this aircraft should understand not merely its specifications but its context. That speed and innovation alone cannot overcome strategic errors or compensate for moral bankruptcy. That political interference in technical decisions can undermine even genuinely revolutionary technologies. That industrial capacity and production scalability often matter more than individual weapon performance in determining conflict outcomes. And most importantly, that engineers bear responsibility, not merely for what they build but for the purposes their creations serve. The Me-163 that hangs in museum silence today was once instrument of terror and hope. Terror for bomber crews who spotted its vapor trail and knew they faced 7 minutes of violent engagement. Hope for German commanders who believed this technological marvel might reverse air war's tide. Yet it failed to alter history's course not because of engineering flaws but because it served lost cause, arrived too late, and existed within a system that valued spectacle over sustainability, quality over quantity, and political intuition over technical expertise. Its legacy is not one of triumph but of warning. A permanent reminder that technology divorced from wisdom becomes not salvation but spectacle, not liberation but liability, not progress but paradox. The rocket plane that arrived too late thus teaches lessons more valuable than those from weapons that arrived on time. That timing matters as much as capability, that strategy trumps technology, that ethics must guide engineering, and that the most advanced weapon ever built cannot compensate for the fundamental errors of the system that created it. These lessons echo across decades into our own technological moment. A moment when artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and autonomous systems present capabilities whose consequences will depend not on their technical sophistication but on the wisdom with which humanity chooses to deploy them. The Me-163's silent fuselage in museum hangars thus speaks across time with urgent relevance. Build not merely what you can, but what you should. Innovate not merely for capability's sake, but for human flourishing's sake. And remember always that the most dangerous failure in engineering is not technical breakdown but moral abdication. The choice to solve fascinating problems while ignoring the purposes those solutions serve. This is the true legacy of the world's first operational rocket fighter. Not its speed records or combat claims, but its enduring warning about the inseparability of technical achievement from ethical responsibility in the human project of technological advancement. The aluminum skin that once carried death now carries memory. A memory of engineering brilliance compromised by moral failure, of technological potential undermined by strategic error, of human ingenuity serving inhuman purposes. This memory demands not celebration but contemplation, not pride in what was built but wisdom about why it was built and for whom. In that contemplation lies the Me-163's most valuable gift to future generations. Not faster aircraft or better engines, but deeper understanding that technology's value lies not in its specifications but in its service to human dignity. A lesson written not in engineering manuals but in the silent testimony of museum artifacts bearing witness to both human genius and human failure. The rocket plane that could climb to 35,000 feet in 4 minutes ultimately teaches us that the most important journeys are not measured in altitude gained but in moral progress achieved. The distance between technical capability and ethical wisdom, between what we can build and what we should build, between engineering brilliance and human compassion. This lesson, forged in the fire of total war and preserved in the silence of a museum hangar, remains our most valuable inheritance from that terrible conflict. Not specific technologies or tactics, but hard-won understanding that our survival depends on recognizing shared fate across borders, ideologies, and generations. Everything else, the hypersonic missiles, the autonomous weapons, even the fragile norm against chemical warfare, flows from this foundational insight. And everything our future requires flows from our capacity to renew it for challenges its architects never imagined. The Me-163 thus stands as humanity's most ambitious cautionary tale, a monument not to what we achieved but to what we failed to achieve. The wisdom to recognize that true progress lies not in pushing machines to their limits but in designing them to protect the humans who must operate them. This recognition transforms the Me-163 from historical curiosity into ethical imperative, a permanent reminder that technologies serving humanity must respect human fragility, that performance without safety leads not to victory but to graves, and that the most advanced machine ever built remains worthless if its operators cannot survive using it. The skid that shattered on German runways thus shattered more than aircraft. It shattered the illusion that engineering brilliance alone could win wars, that speed alone could overcome strategic reality, that technological spectacle could substitute for operational wisdom. This shattering, painful, costly, tragic, remains worth the price if it saves future generations from repeating the same catastrophic error. The pilots who flew the Komet, those who died and those who survived, ultimately delivered more valuable payload than any bomb load. The hard-won understanding that speed without safety is suicide, that engineering without ethics is catastrophe, and that the most advanced machine ever built remains worthless if its operators cannot survive using it. This understanding, forged in chemical fires and shattered skids, documented in medical records and pilot diaries, preserved in the lifelong advocacy of survivors, remains our most valuable inheritance from this tragic aircraft. Not specifications or speed records, but hard-won wisdom that capability without conscience serves not human advancement but human sacrifice. The rocket plane that raced through the sky in 7-minute bursts ultimately raced against humanity itself, and lost not because it was slow, but because it was too fast for the fragile humans who flew it, too fast for the moral considerations warfare demands, too fast for the compassion that must guide all technology serving human purposes. In that loss lies its victory, the warning it bequeaths to future generations developing technologies that again threaten to outrun human capacity for wise judgment. A warning written not in engineering manuals but in the silent trauma of pilots who flew too fast to remain human, too fast to choose wisely, too fast to survive their own machines. The Me-163's ultimate monument is not the aircraft preserved in museums but the safety protocols protecting modern pilots, the ethical frameworks guiding aerospace engineers, the institutional safeguards preventing recurrence of its tragedies. A legacy not of metal and fire but of wisdom purchased with 82 lives and countless injuries. This legacy demands not reverence but responsibility, not admiration for speed records but commitment to ensuring no future technology again prioritizes performance over human survival. The silent fuselage hanging in Dayton thus issues permanent challenge to every engineer, designer, and technologist who views it. Will you build machines that serve humanity or machines that sacrifice humanity to their own perfection? Will you prioritize specifications over safety, speed over survival, spectacle over substance? Or will you learn from this aircraft's tragedy and design technologies that enhance rather than endanger human life? This challenge extends beyond aerospace into every domain of technological development. Artificial intelligence that must serve human judgment rather than replace it, autonomous vehicles that must prioritize passenger safety over performance metrics, cyber systems that must protect human dignity rather than exploit vulnerability. The Me 163's Ghost whispers warning across these domains. That technologies optimized for peak performance without regard for human fragility create not progress but trauma. That every speed record, every efficiency gain, every performance metric achieved through human suffering ultimately extracts payment in forms that outlast the achievements themselves. That the true measure of innovation lies not in what machines can do but in how they treat the humans who operate them. This warning remains urgently relevant as humanity stands at thresholds of technologies whose destructive potential may exceed our moral capacity to control them. Artificial intelligence systems making strategic decisions beyond human comprehension, cyber weapons collapsing critical infrastructure supporting modern civilization, autonomous systems whose behavior may exceed human prediction or control. The Me 163 syndrome persists not as historical curiosity but as active danger in contemporary weapons development. A seductive belief that sufficiently impressive technology can transcend strategic constraints and guarantee security through sheer capability. Yet history consistently demonstrates the opposite. Weapons of maximum speed often prove strategically counterproductive, consuming resources needed for genuinely decisive systems while creating vulnerabilities through complexity, predictability, and temporal mismatch. The Me 163 destroyed few bombers but accelerated Germany's defeat by diverting resources from mobile forces needed to counter Soviet offensives. Hypersonic weapons may compress decision timelines to dangerous levels where human judgment cannot function effectively. Autonomous weapons may remove human judgment from life and death decisions precisely when moral reasoning matters most. Each represents a contemporary manifestation of the Me 163 fallacy, the confusion of speed with security, of engineering achievement with strategic wisdom, of capability with significance. The aluminum fragments salvaged from crashed Me 163s thus embody not merely failed engineering but failed wisdom. A reminder that technical brilliance without strategic insight creates instruments of anxiety rather than security, that engineering capability without ethical constraint leads inevitably to arms race dynamics that endanger all humanity, and that humanity's greatest challenge lies not in building faster weapons but in developing wisdom to know when not to build them at all. This challenge demands not greater engineering brilliance but greater moral courage, the courage to recognize when technical possibility should be restrained by strategic necessity, when engineering ambition should yield to operational reality, when the capacity to build something should be tempered by wisdom about whether it serves genuine human needs. The rocket plane that could cross the sound barrier's threshold ultimately could not cross the chasm between technological capability and human wisdom. A chasm that remains humanity's most dangerous frontier not because it is technological but because it is moral. In this sense, the Me 163's greatest legacy lies not in what it achieved but in what it failed to achieve, the recognition that true security emerges not from maximum speed but from maximum wisdom in its restraint, not from pushing engineering to its limits but from understanding when those limits should not be pushed at all. The scattered fragments whisper this truth more eloquently than any specification sheet ever could. That security emerges not from weapons that can destroy cities but from societies capable of choosing not to build them, not from engineering spectacle but from ethical discipline, not from technological parity but from moral superiority that recognizes some capabilities should remain unrealized regardless of technical feasibility. As we stand today at new technological thresholds with artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, and cyber capabilities transforming warfare's character once again, the Me 163's lesson remains urgent and unambiguous. The most dangerous weapons are not those that destroy cities but those that destroy our capacity for wise judgment about when and how to use power at all. And against that enemy, technological hubris divorced from moral wisdom, no amount of engineering brilliance offers protection. Only humility, foresight, and courage to choose restraint when capability tempts us toward excess. The final mission of the last operational Me-163 occurred not in combat but in surrender, a training flight that ended with perfect landing on concrete runway, pilot climbing from cockpit, aircraft towed to storage hangar. No ceremony marked this retirement. No speeches celebrated its service. It was simply another obsolete weapon replaced by history's relentless march. Yet that quiet end contained profound symbolism. The rocket plane that had terrified bomber crews, accelerated arms race dynamics, and represented Germany's last technological hope ended its service not with bang but whimper, faded into irrelevance not through defeat but through obsolescence, not by enemy action but by time's relentless march. This quiet end revealed the Me-163's deepest truth. Weapons that depend on technological surprise for strategic relevance inevitably become irrelevant when surprise fades and technology evolves. The Me-163 was revolutionary in 1944. By 1947, American jets matched its speed with far greater endurance. By 1955, rocket planes like the X-15 achieved its performance with safety systems making pilot survival likely rather than miraculous. This transience of technological advantage remains warfare's most enduring lesson, a lesson applicable to contemporary hypersonic weapons, cyber capabilities, and AI systems whose current impressiveness may prove equally fleeting when countermeasures mature and strategic context evolves. The Me-163 thus stands as permanent warning against technological determinism, the fallacy that specific weapons systems determine historical outcomes rather than human choices about how to use them. Germany possessed rocket fighters but lacked wisdom to deploy them effectively. Allied commanders possessed piston-engine fighters but demonstrated superior operational art that compensated for technological disadvantage. Technology provided tools, human judgment determined outcomes. This truth remains unaltered by technological advancement. AI will not save us from poor strategy. Cyber weapons will not compensate for flawed diplomacy. Hypersonic missiles will not substitute for wise statecraft. The Me-163's ultimate monument is not aircraft preserved in museums but recognition that echoes across generations of strategists, engineers, and ethicists who have studied its history. That genuine security emerges not from maximum destructive power but from maximum wisdom in its restraint, not from capacity to build impressive weapons but from courage to recognize when impressive weapons serve no genuine purpose. This recognition, fragile, contested, and perpetually threatened by new technological temptations, remains humanity's most vital defense against our own destructive ingenuity, a defense no amount of engineering brilliance can provide but one that has repeatedly saved us from catastrophic consequences of our most terrifying creations. The rocket plane that could climb to the edge of space ultimately delivered more valuable payload. Hard-won wisdom about technology's proper place in human affairs. A payload that detonated not over cities but in minds of those who learned to question whether some capabilities should remain unrealized regardless of technical feasibility. And in that detonation, silent, invisible, but transformative, lies enduring promise that humanity's greatest engineering achievement will never be weapon of unprecedented speed but society of unprecedented wisdom, where capacity to destroy is forever tempered by courage to create, and where most powerful weapon in our arsenal is not one that can shatter mountains but one that can heal divisions between peoples. The Me-163 flew its last mission in 1945. Its lesson flies still, through archives where historians study its blueprints, through classrooms where students learn its history, through policy debates where strategists weigh new weapons' wisdom, through quiet moments when engineers pause before drafting designs to ask not, "Can we build this?" but "Should we?" That question, simple in formulation but profound in implication, remains the Me-163's true legacy. Not aluminum skin or rocket engines, but moral challenge that transcends technology and time, demanding we choose wisdom over spectacle, humanity over hubris, life over death. Not because we lack capacity for destruction, but because we possess capacity for something greater. The revolutionary rocket plane thus achieved immortality not through steel and rivets but through question it bequeathed to future generations. When technology offers capability without wisdom, will we have courage to choose restraint? The answer to that question will determine not merely which weapons we build, but whether we deserve to survive their existence. And in that determination lies truth more enduring than any aircraft. That humanity's survival depends not on engineering brilliance but on moral courage. The courage to build not what we can, but what we should. Not what impresses enemies, but what honors our shared humanity. Not weapons that can destroy worlds, but wisdom that preserves them. The Me 163 was built perfectly. Its lesson must be learned perfectly too, for in that learning lies our only hope of building future where revolutionary rocket planes become museum relics not because they were obsolete, but because humanity finally chose peace over spectacle, wisdom over weapons, and life over the terrible beauty of destruction, perfectly engineered but perfectly unnecessary. The aluminum that once carried death now carries memory. A memory demanding we build not faster machines but wiser societies. Not more powerful weapons but more compassionate technologies. Not instruments of destruction but tools of human flourishing. This memory, forged in fire of total war, preserved in silence of museum hangars, renewed daily through conscious choice, remains our most valuable inheritance. Not specific inventions or discoveries, but hard-won understanding that our survival depends on recognizing shared fate across borders, ideologies, and generations. Everything else, the hypersonic missiles, the autonomous drones, even the fragile norms protecting human dignity, flows from this foundational insight. And everything our future requires flows from our capacity to renew it for challenges its architects never imagined. The Me 163 hangs silent in its museum cradle, a monument not to what we achieved but to what we failed to achieve. The wisdom to recognize that true progress lies not in pushing machines to their limits but in designing them to protect the humans who must operate them. This recognition, painful, costly, hard-won, remains our most valuable inheritance from that terrible conflict. Not speed records or climb rates, but the understanding that capability without conscience serves not human advancement but human sacrifice. The rocket plane that could touch the edge of space ultimately could not touch the human heart, could not inspire the compassion, the wisdom, the moral courage required to ensure its power served life rather than death. In that failure lies its greatest gift, permanent reminder that technologies serving humanity must respect human fragility, that performance without safety leads not to victory but to graves, and that the most advanced machine ever built remains worthless if its operators cannot survive using it. This reminder, etched not in stone but in silent steel, not in words but in absence of the 82 pilots who never returned, demands our attention today as urgently as it did in 1945. For the Me 163's ghost walks among us still. Not in museum hangars alone, but in every laboratory where engineers optimize for speed over safety, in every boardroom where executives prioritize performance metrics over human consequences, in every war room where commanders demand weapons without regard for the humans who must wield them. Its whisper echoes across decades. Remember the pilots who flew too fast to survive their own machines. Remember the designers who solved fascinating problems while ignoring human cost. Remember the commanders who demanded spectacle over substance. Remember and choose differently. Build not merely what you can, but what you should. Innovate not merely for capability's sake, but for human flourishing's sake. And remember always that the most dangerous failure in engineering is not technical breakdown but moral abdication. The choice to solve fascinating problems while ignoring the purposes those solutions serve. This is the Me 163's final lesson. Not written in specification sheets or combat reports, but whispered in the silence between heartbeats of every engineer who pauses before drafting a design to ask not, can we, but should we? In that pause lies our salvation. In that question lies our humanity. And in that humanity lies our only hope of building future where revolutionary machines serve life rather than death. A future where speed serves safety, capability serves compassion, and engineering serves ethics. The Me 163 could climb to 35,000 feet in 4 minutes, but it could not climb above the fundamental truth that haunts all technology. That machines exist to serve humanity, not humanity to serve machines. This truth, simple, profound, eternal, remains our most valuable inheritance from that tragic aircraft. And it remains our only hope of ensuring that future generations inherit not museums filled with weapons that killed their creators, but worlds filled with technologies that enhance human life. The rocket plane that raced through the sky in 7-minute bursts ultimately teaches us that the most important journey is not upward toward speed records, but inward toward wisdom, The wisdom to recognize that true progress lies not in how fast we can go, but in how wisely we choose where to go. This wisdom, forged in chemical fires and shattered skids, purchased with 82 lives and countless injuries, preserved in the silent testimony of museum artifacts, remains our most valuable inheritance from the Me 163. Not speed, not climb rate, not engineering brilliance, but the hard-won understanding that capability without conscience leads not to progress but to catastrophe. And in that understanding lies our only hope of building future where revolutionary machines serve life rather than death. A future where the most advanced technology ever built is not weapon of unprecedented speed but society of unprecedented wisdom. The Me 163 hangs silent, but its lesson screams across time. Choose wisdom over speed, humanity over hubris, life over death. Choose and survive.